In this video, we're going to be breaking down one insane theory for every South Park character. Let's get started with the video. Stan Marsh, the depression filter theory. Stan Marsh is supposed to be the normal kid in South Park, the reasonable one. The straight man who reacts to the insanity around him with appropriate confusion and moral concern. He is the audience surrogate, the character through whom viewers experience the absurdity of South Park, Colorado. But over the course of more than 20 seasons, something has changed. Stan has become increasingly cynical, jaded, and nihilistic. The world around him has grown darker, more hopeless, more absurd. Events that once shocked him now barely register. The optimism of childhood has been replaced by a deep, pervasive sense that everything is terrible and nothing matters. According to a compelling fan theory, this transformation is not just character development, or the natural result of growing up in South Park. Stan Marsh suffers from clinical depression, and the increasingly dark tone of South Park itself represents the world filtered through his depressive perception. Everything viewers see is colored by Stan's deteriorating mental state. The show has not gotten darker. Stan's mind has gotten darker, and because he is the lens through which South Park is experienced, his depression becomes the viewer's reality. The Asperger's revelation. The most explicit evidence for this theory comes from the episode You're Getting Old and its follow-up, Asperger's. In these episodes, Stan experiences a profound shift in perception. Everything he sees literally looks like excrement. Everything he hears sounds distorted and terrible. Music that others enjoy sounds like defecation noises to him. Movies that entertain others appear as literal feces on screen. Food tastes wrong, colors look wrong. The entire world transforms into something unbearable. This is not presented as metaphor or exaggeration for comedic effect. The show depicts Stan's perception as genuinely altered, with the animation and sound design changing to reflect what he experiences. Other characters remain unchanged, enjoying the same things they always enjoyed, experiencing the same reality they always experienced. Only Stan perceives this shift. The key revelation comes when Stan discovers that drinking alcohol makes the world appear normal again. When he consumes whiskey, stolen from his father's supply, the distortions disappear. Suddenly, music sounds like music. Movies look like movies. The world returns to the familiar appearance he remembers from childhood. This temporary relief from his altered perception comes only through substance abuse, through self-medication with alcohol. According to the theory, this episode is not simply about Stan having a bad day or going through a phase. It is a visualization of clinical depression. The literal transformation of the world into excrement represents how depression alters perception. People suffering from depression do not experience a world that has objectively changed. They experience a subjective reality filtered through their illness, where things that should bring joy bring only emptiness, where activities that should be engaging feel pointless, where the future appears bleak regardless of objective circumstances. The fact that alcohol temporarily restores Stan's perception to normal mirrors, how many people with untreated depression turn to substances to manage their symptoms. They are not seeking intoxication for pleasure. They are seeking relief from an unbearable perceptual state, trying to feel normal again, trying to see the world the way others seem to see it. The Asperger's episode reveals the truth about Stan's character and about South Park itself. Stan has been filtering reality through depression for the entire series. What viewers experience as the show's content is actually the world as perceived by a depressed 10-year-old boy. The darkness is not objective. It is Stan's darkness, projected onto everything around him. The depression timeline. Examining South Park's progression across its seasons reveals a pattern that supports this interpretation. In the earliest seasons, Stan exhibits relatively normal childhood psychology. He experiences wonder, excitement, and genuine happiness. He forms friendships with enthusiasm. He pursues romantic interests with hope. He believes that problems can be solved, that adults can be trusted to do the right thing, that justice generally prevails. The show's tone during these early years, while already featuring dark comedy and satire, maintains a certain lightness. The children are resilient. Bad situations resolve. The town of South Park, despite its absurdities, functions as a community. As the series progresses into middle seasons, Stan becomes noticeably more cynical. He questions authority more aggressively. He expresses doubt about whether anything matters. He becomes frustrated with the repetitive nature of crises in South Park, with the way lessons are never learned, with the constant cycle of problems that never truly resolve. His reactions to events shift from shock and concern to weary recognition. He has seen variations of the same patterns before. He knows how things will end. His hope diminishes. In recent seasons, Stan has transformed into something approaching nihilism. He expects the worst outcomes. He is rarely surprised by betrayals, stupidity, or cruelty, because he has come to view these as the natural state of things. His emotional range has narrowed. Joy is rare and fleeting. Anger and frustration are constants. Resignation pervades his worldview. This progression mirrors the trajectory of untreated depression. The illness does not typically manifest as sudden onset, but as gradual deterioration. Someone with depression might function relatively normally at first, with only occasional episodes of darkness. As the condition worsens without treatment, those episodes become more frequent and more severe. Eventually, the depressive state becomes baseline reality, with only rare moments of relief. Stan's character arc across 20-plus seasons demonstrates this exact pattern. The theory proposes that Stan has been suffering from depression since early childhood, possibly since the series began, but the severity has increased over time. What started as manageable symptoms has progressed into chronic, life-altering mental illness. The show's increasingly dark tone does not reflect South Park becoming a worse place to live. It reflects Stan's worsening depression, making him perceive the world as progressively more terrible. Why Stan is the central consciousness. South Park features 4 main characters, yet Stan occupies a unique position among them. Episodes disproportionately begin and end from his perspective. Major emotional beats center on his reactions. When the show wants to deliver a serious message or sincere moment, it typically uses Stan as the vehicle. He delivers the moralizing speeches at episodes' conclusions. He articulates the lessons learned, the observations about society, the commentary on events. This structural centrality suggests that Stan is not simply one of 4 equal protagonists, but rather the primary consciousness through which South Park is experienced. According to the theory, viewers see South Park through Stan's eyes because the show itself is Stan's perception. The narrative perspective is literally his point of view. What is presented as objective reality is actually his subjective experience filtered through his mental state. This explains why other characters seem less affected by the darkness that pervades the show. Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny exist in the same town, experience the same events, and encounter the same absurdities. Yet their psychological responses differ dramatically from Stan's. Kyle maintains his moral certainty and passionate engagement with justice. Cartman thrives in chaos, viewing it as opportunity rather than tragedy. Kenny endures suffering with resilience rather than despair. If South Park's darkness were objective, all 4 boys should be equally damaged by it. But they are not. Stan alone carries the weight of South Park's horror because he alone is experiencing it through the filter of clinical depression. The others perceive a different reality, one where problems are challenges to overcome rather than evidence of cosmic meaninglessness, where bad events are unfortunate rather than inevitable, where hope remains possible. Stan cannot access this alternative perception. His depression locks him into a worldview where everything is terrible and getting worse. The theory accounts for this discrepancy by positioning Stan as the narrative filter. The show's content represents his depressive interpretation of events, not the events themselves. If the series were told from Kyle's perspective, South Park might appear as a place of moral challenge that can be met through passionate advocacy. If told from Cartman's perspective, it might appear as a playground for manipulation and self-advancement. If told from Kenny's perspective, it might appear as a sight of survival and resilience. But the series is told from Stan's perspective, and his perspective is distorted by untreated mental illness. The depression creates the darkness viewers perceive as South Park's reality. The Wendy connection. Wendy Testerberger's role in Stan's life takes on profound significance through this theoretical lens. She is Stan's girlfriend, though their relationship experiences frequent breakups and reconciliations. The pattern is notable. When Stan and Wendy are together, Stan's episodes tend to be lighter in tone. When they break up, the darkness intensifies. The "You're Getting Old" and Asperger's episodes, where Stan's depression becomes explicitly visualized, are triggered specifically by Wendy breaking up with him. This is not coincidental. According to the theory, Wendy represents Stan's only anchor to hope, normalcy, and childhood innocence. She is the one element of his life that still connects him to positive emotions, to the possibility that things can be good, to the memory of who he was before depression consumed his worldview. When Wendy is present in his life, Stan has something to hold on to, a reason to fight against the encroaching darkness. Her presence reminds him that connection is possible, that someone can care about him, that he is capable of experiencing emotions beyond emptiness and despair. She is his tether to the world as it exists outside his depression. When Wendy leaves, that tether is severed. Stan loses his last defense against the full weight of his mental illness. Without her, there is nothing preventing his depression from consuming his entire perception. The breakup in "You're Getting Old" does not cause Stan's depression, but it removes the final barrier preventing him from drowning in it. The alcohol that temporarily restores his perception in Asperger's is a substitute for what Wendy provided, a way to feel normal again, a way to see the world without the depressive filter. But alcohol is not a sustainable solution. It is self-medication, a coping mechanism that brings temporary relief while ultimately worsening the underlying condition. The theory suggests that Stan's relationship with Wendy is less about romantic love and more about psychological survival. She represents his connection to life before depression, to the possibility that the world is not as terrible as his illness makes it appear. When she is gone, he has no evidence to contradict his depression's narrative. The illness tells him everything is worthless, and without Wendy, he has no reason to believe otherwise. The alcoholism at 10 years old. The fact that Stan develops a drinking problem at age 10 is one of the most disturbing elements of the Asperger's episode, and one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the depression theory. Children do not typically develop alcoholism from normal sadness or typical childhood problems. The progression from experimentation to dependency, especially at such a young age, indicates severe underlying psychological distress. Stan is not drinking to rebel, to fit in with peers, or out of curiosity about adult behaviors. He is drinking because it is the only thing that makes his perception of reality tolerable. This is textbook self-medication. According to the theory, Stan discovered that alcohol temporarily alleviates his depressive symptoms. When he drinks, the world looks normal again. Music sounds like music. Colors appear correct. The crushing weight of meaninglessness lifts temporarily. This relief is so profound that he continues drinking, despite being 10 years old, despite the obvious wrongness of a child consuming alcohol, despite the consequences. He needs the relief more than he fears the repercussions. This pattern mirrors what occurs in many adults with untreated depression who turn to substance abuse. They are not seeking pleasure or escape in the conventional sense. They are seeking normal function, trying to feel the way other people apparently feel naturally, attempting to access a baseline state that their illness denies them. The alcoholism also suggests a genetic component to Stan's condition. Randy Marsh, Stan's father, is portrayed throughout the series as having severe problems with alcohol and substance abuse. He drinks excessively, makes terrible decisions while intoxicated, and demonstrates addictive patterns with various substances and behaviors. If Randy carries genetic predisposition toward both depression and addiction, Stan would have inherited this vulnerability. The theory proposes that Stan's depression may have biological roots in addition to any environmental factors. He did not simply become depressed because of events in South Park. He has a genetic predisposition toward depressive illness, inherited from his father, who may be self-medicating his own undiagnosed mental illness through his various addictions and obsessions. The fact that a 10-year-old child turns to alcohol as a solution to his problems indicates that Stan is experiencing trauma-level psychological distress. Children develop such extreme coping mechanisms only when their suffering exceeds their capacity to manage it through normal means. The question the theory raises is, what trauma is Stan responding to? The answer is that he is responding to living inside his own depressed mind, which presents him with an unbearable version of reality that he cannot escape, except through substances. Why the world keeps getting darker. One of the most consistent observations about South Park across its run is that the show has become progressively bleaker, more nihilistic, and more despairing. Early seasons, while featuring dark comedy and satire, maintained an underlying sense that problems could be addressed, that communities could function, that individual actions mattered. Recent seasons present a world where nothing changes, where terrible people face no consequences, where every solution creates worse problems, where hope is naive and cynicism is wisdom. Critics and viewers have noted this tonal shift, usually attributing it to the show's creators becoming more pessimistic, or to cultural changes making darker comedy more acceptable. But according to the depression theory, the explanation is simpler and more internal to the show's narrative structure. South Park has become darker because Stan's depression has become worse. The show's tone reflects his mental state. As his untreated illness has progressed from manageable to severe to chronic, his perception of reality has darkened correspondingly. The world of South Park has not objectively deteriorated. Stan's ability to perceive anything good in it has deteriorated. This interpretation transforms what appears to be creative evolution into character development. The show is not changing direction arbitrarily. It is documenting the progression of a mental illness through its effect on perception. Each season, Stan's depression worsens slightly. Each season, the world he perceives becomes slightly darker. The accumulation of this progression across 20-plus seasons results in the dramatic tonal difference between early South Park and contemporary South Park. If the theory is correct, the show will continue to darken as long as Stan's depression remains untreated. There is no reason to expect improvement. Depression does not resolve on its own, especially not in a 10-year-old child with no access to therapy or psychiatric care, living in a dysfunctional family in a chaotic town. Every event that occurs in South Park, every crisis and disaster and moment of stupidity, reinforces Stan's depressive worldview. His illness uses each incident as evidence for its narrative. The world is terrible, people are awful, nothing matters, everything is pointless. The show's increasing darkness is Stan's increasing darkness, and it will not improve until he receives treatment for his condition. The other boys don't see it. While Stan experiences South Park as progressively unbearable, his three closest friends seem far less damaged by their experiences. Kyle continues to fight passionately for justice and moral correctness. Cartman thrives on chaos and views the town's dysfunction as opportunity. Kenny endures death and resurrection without apparent psychological deterioration. None of them display the same crushing despair that characterizes Stan's recent development. This discrepancy makes sense if they are experiencing a different reality than Stan perceives. According to the theory, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny are not filtering their experience through clinical depression. They see South Park as it objectively is, or at least as their own psychological frameworks interpreted, without the distorting lens of depressive illness. Kyle's moral crusading, while sometimes obsessive, comes from a place of passionate engagement with the world. He believes his actions matter, that fighting for good is worthwhile, that justice can prevail. This is not the psychology of someone experiencing depression. Depression creates apathy and meaninglessness. Kyle has neither. His worldview, while occasionally naive, reflects someone who perceives the world as containing real moral weight and possibility for positive change. Cartman's sociopathy positions him at the opposite extreme from depression. Where depression creates emptiness and despair, sociopathy creates grandiosity and excitement. Cartman views South Park as a playground where he can manipulate and dominate. He does not suffer from the world's chaos because he creates much of it himself and enjoys the results. His psychology is disturbed in different ways than Stan's, but it is not depressive. He experiences engagement, excitement, satisfaction, emotions that depression makes impossible. Kenny's resilience despite repeated death is perhaps the strongest evidence that the other boys experience reality differently than Stan. Kenny dies horribly, repeatedly, and comes back without apparent trauma accumulation. He does not develop Stan's nihilism or despair. He continues engaging with life, forming friendships, pursuing interests. If Kenny can experience literal death hundreds of times without becoming as psychologically damaged as Stan appears to be, it suggests that something unique to Stan's psychology is creating his suffering. The theory identifies a unique factor as clinical depression. Stan is not reacting normally to an objectively terrible environment. He is reacting to an environment made subjectively terrible by his illness. Why this theory makes sense. The depression theory elegantly explains multiple aspects of South Park that otherwise appear inconsistent or arbitrary. It accounts for the show's tonal shift across seasons, without requiring external explanations about creative direction changes. It explains why Stan occupies a unique narrative position, despite being one of 4 main characters. It makes sense of the Asperger's episode's literalization of perceptual distortion. It provides psychological framework for understanding Stan's character development, from hopeful child to resigned nihilist. The theory is supported by the show's own explicit content. You're Getting Old and Asperger's directly depict Stan experiencing depression symptoms. The episodes do not present this as metaphor, but as literal perceptual change caused by psychological condition. The show has confirmed that Stan suffers from depression. The theory simply extends this confirmation backward and forward, suggesting that what was made explicit in those episodes has been implicit throughout the series. Stan has always been depressed. The show has always been filtered. Through his depression, viewers have always been seeing South Park through the lens of a mentally ill child's distorted perception. This reframes South Park from dark comedy into tragedy. The jokes remain, but they take on different meaning when understood as coping mechanisms, developed by a child whose mind makes reality unbearable. The satire remains, but it becomes the observations of someone whose illness forces him to see the worst in everything. The show's increasing bleakness becomes documentation of disease progression. What appeared to be entertainment becomes clinical portrait of depression's effect on a young mind. The theory does not require viewers to stop enjoying South Park or to reinterpret the show as something other than comedy. It simply adds a layer of understanding that transforms appreciation of the show's construction. Recognizing Stan's depression as the narrative lens deepens rather than diminishes the viewing experience. It provides coherent explanation for creative choices that might otherwise seem random or poorly justified. The tragedy of Stan Marsh is that he is trapped in a reality manufactured by his own malfunctioning brain. He cannot see the world as others see it because his depression will not permit accurate perception. Everything is filtered through his illness, transformed into evidence for meaninglessness and despair. The comedy of South Park is one boy's desperate attempt to find humor in a world his mind insists is unbearably terrible. The darkness of South Park is one child's undiagnosed, untreated mental illness projected onto everyone and everything around him. And because Stan is the consciousness through which the show is experienced, his depression becomes the viewer's reality. There is no escape from his perception, because there is no perspective outside it. Stan's depression is the show. The show is Stan's depression, and unless he receives treatment he will never have access to, the darkness will only deepen. Season after season, year after year, his young mind will sink further into an illness that transforms the world into something increasingly unbearable, until even the brief moments of light that occasionally break through are swallowed by the encroaching void. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Kyle Berflovsky, The Eternal Guilt Theory. Kyle Broflovsky, The Eternal Guilt Theory. Kyle Broflovsky is the moral center of South Park. While his friends navigate the town's constant crises with varying degrees of self-interest, apathy, or active malice, Kyle consistently positions himself as the defender of what is right. He fights against injustice wherever he perceives it. He advocates for the vulnerable. He stands up to bullies, challenges corrupt authority, and refuses to accept moral compromise. This commitment to ethics appears admirable on its surface, the behavior of a good person trying to make the world better. But examination of Kyle's behavior reveals something more complex and more troubling than simple moral conviction. Kyle does not simply prefer doing good. He is compulsively driven to fight every moral wrong he encounters, even when fighting is futile, even when intervention causes him personal harm, even when the battle is not his to fight. He cannot let things go. He cannot accept moral ambiguity. He takes every injustice personally, internalizing responsibility for problems that extend far beyond his control or capacity to solve. According to a compelling fan theory, this pattern is not personality quirk or admirable dedication to justice. It is the manifestation of inherited generational trauma. Kyle's Jewish identity carries with it centuries of persecution, suffering, and genocide. This trauma does not simply disappear with each generation. It is transmitted from parent to child through cultural memory, family stories, and psychological patterns. Kyle has inherited the weight of this history, and it has created in him a pathological sense of guilt and responsibility. He is psychologically incapable of allowing injustice to pass without intervention, because his entire identity is built on inherited responsibility for suffering he did not cause and cannot prevent. The Moral Crusader. Who cannot rest? Kyle's approach to moral problems differs fundamentally from how others engage with ethical questions. When he perceives injustice, he does not carefully consider whether intervention is appropriate, whether the problem is his responsibility, or whether his involvement will actually improve the situation. He immediately leaps into action, compelled by an internal pressure that appears to override rational decision-making. Other characters can observe unfairness and choose not to engage. They can recognize that some problems are beyond their control, or not their responsibility to solve. They can prioritize their own well-being over abstract moral principles. Kyle cannot. When he encounters something he deems wrong, he must fight it. This is not a choice he makes. It is a compulsion he experiences. The drive to intervene operates at a level that precedes conscious thought. He does not decide to become the town's moral guardian. He is constitutionally incapable of being anything else. This pattern manifests across countless episodes. Kyle takes personal responsibility for South Park's moral state despite being a 10-year-old child with no actual authority or power. He launches crusades against corporate greed, political corruption, social injustice, and cultural decay as though these massive systemic problems can be solved through his individual effort. When his campaigns fail, when the problems prove intractable, when his efforts change nothing, Kyle does not accept defeat and move on. He becomes frustrated, angry, and sometimes despairing, but he cannot stop trying. According to the theory, this goes beyond normal ethical commitment. It represents pathological inability to let moral wrongs exist unaddressed. The psychological term for this is hyper-responsibility, a trauma response where individuals feel personally accountable for outcomes they cannot control. Kyle exhibits this constantly. He holds himself responsible for preventing suffering that he has no realistic power to prevent. He feels guilty when bad things happen, even though he did not cause them. He believes that if he just tried harder, thought more cleverly, fought more passionately, he could fix everything wrong with South Park. This is not heroic dedication. It is psychological burden that makes normal childhood impossible. The theory identifies the source of this hyper-responsibility as generational trauma transmitted through Kyle's Jewish identity. His ancestors experienced persecution for centuries. They survived genocide. They were murdered for existing. This history creates patterns of thought and behavior that persist across generations, even when the immediate threat has passed. Children of Holocaust survivors, for example, often display anxiety patterns and hypervigilance, despite not having experienced the Holocaust themselves. The trauma is inherited psychologically through family dynamics, cultural memory, and the unspoken weight of history. Generational Jewish trauma. Judaism is not simply a religion or ethnicity to Kyle. It is the central organizing principle of his identity, the lens through which he understands himself and his place in the world. The show explicitly addresses his Jewishness in numerous episodes, making it impossible to separate Kyle's character from his Jewish identity. But being Jewish carries more than religious observance or ethnic heritage. It carries the accumulated weight of thousands of years of persecution, expulsion, and attempted annihilation. This is not abstract historical knowledge. It is lived cultural memory passed down through families and communities. According to the theory, Kyle has inherited this trauma as surely as he inherited his red hair. Generational trauma operates through multiple mechanisms. Parents who experienced or whose own parents experienced severe trauma often raise their children with patterns of anxiety, hypervigilance, and heightened sensitivity to threat. Even when the parents consciously try to avoid transmitting their fears, unconscious patterns emerge in how they interact with their children, what warnings they give, what dangers they emphasize. The message transmitted is that the world is dangerous, that persecution can happen at any time, that vigilance is necessary for survival. Children internalize these messages, even when they do not consciously recognize them. For Jewish children, this general mechanism combines with specific cultural memory of the Holocaust. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews less than a century ago is not ancient history. It is recent enough that survivors are still alive, that children grew up with grandparents who experienced concentration camps, that families can trace relatives who were murdered. The Holocaust becomes reference point that shapes how subsequent generations understand their identity and their relationship to the world. The phrase, "never again," is not just moral declaration. It is psychological imperative that structures thought patterns. If genocide can happen, if an entire people can be targeted for annihilation, then vigilance and resistance are not optional. They are necessary for survival. According to the theory, Kyle carries this weight constantly. His Jewish identity connects him to this history of suffering, making it part of his psychological makeup, even though he was born decades after the Holocaust and lives in relative safety in Colorado. The trauma is inherited through cultural transmission, through the stories he has heard, through the warnings implicit and explicit about what can happen to Jewish people. This creates in him the sense that he must always be on guard, must always fight against injustice, must never allow persecution to go unchallenged because allowing it means enabling the conditions that led to genocide. Why Cartman's anti-Semitism destroys. Kyle Eric Cartman directs various forms of cruelty toward all his friends, but his attacks on Kyle consistently focus on Kyle's Jewish identity. He makes Holocaust jokes. He dresses as Hitler. He forms anti-Semitic organizations. He uses religious slurs. He questions Kyle's right to exist based on his ethnicity. These attacks affect Kyle differently than Cartman's cruelty affects others. When Cartman insults Stan or Kenny, they become angry or fight back, but they do not experience existential crises. When Cartman attacks Kyle's Jewishness, Kyle's reactions are disproportionate. He becomes enraged in ways that exceed normal anger. He obsesses over Cartman's behavior. He cannot let the attacks go unaddressed. According to the theory, this disparity exists because Cartman's anti-Semitism touches Kyle's inherited trauma. The attacks are not simply bullying or insults. They trigger the generational wound that Kyle carries. When Cartman makes Holocaust jokes, he is not just being offensive. He is invoking the actual genocide that shapes Kyle's psychological reality. When Cartman dresses as Hitler, he is embodying the person who ordered Kyle's people exterminated. When Cartman uses anti-Semitic slurs, he is using the same language that accompanied centuries of persecution. These actions activate Kyle's inherited trauma response. His ancestors faced people exactly like Cartman, people who hated them for their identity, who wanted them eradicated, who used similar language and imagery to justify violence and murder. Kyle cannot ignore Cartman, because ignoring him would mean ignoring the warning signs that Kyle's cultural memory has taught him to recognize. His hyper-vigilant trauma response identifies Cartman as genuine threat, not just annoying child. The theory suggests that Kyle's relationship with Cartman represents the eternal dynamic between persecutor and persecuted. Cartman embodies everything Kyle's ancestors suffered against: hate, violence, attempts at domination and annihilation. Kyle embodies the resistance that allowed Jewish people to survive despite centuries of persecution. Their conflict is not just personal rivalry between two children. It is psychological reenactment of historical trauma played out in modern form. Kyle must fight Cartman because fighting represents survival. Resistance represents honoring those who died. Standing up represents refusing to let persecution succeed. If Kyle ignored Cartman's anti-Semitism, he would be violating the psychological imperative transmitted through generations. Never again means never allowing it to begin, never giving ground to hate, never normalizing persecution. This makes their conflict unresolvable. Kyle is not choosing to engage with Cartman's cruelty. He is compelled by inherited trauma to resist it. The martyrdom complex. Kyle exhibits throughout the series a willingness, even an inclination, to sacrifice himself for moral causes. He puts his physical safety at risk. He endures social ostracism. He accepts suffering as part of his role. This martyrdom complex manifests in episodes where Kyle literally offers his life for others, or takes on suffering to prevent others from experiencing it. He does not do this reluctantly. He does it as though this is his natural role, as though he was made for this purpose. According to the theory, this pattern reflects Jewish martyrdom tradition. The history of Jewish persecution includes countless stories of individuals who accepted death rather than abandon their identity or their people. Martyrdom becomes valorized, transformed into ultimate expression of faith and commitment. Dying for one's people or one's principles is not simply tragedy, it is sacred act. Kyle has internalized this cultural narrative. He understands himself as someone whose role includes potential sacrifice. If fighting for justice requires suffering, he will suffer. If protecting others requires endangering himself, he will accept danger. This is not merely brave. It is evidence of how thoroughly the martyrdom narrative has shaped his sense of identity and purpose. The martyrdom complex serves psychological function for someone carrying generational trauma. If Kyle can position himself as willing martyr, he gains sense of control over suffering that his ancestors could not control. They were victims of persecution they did not choose and could not prevent. Kyle chooses his suffering by selecting moral battles and accepting the consequences. This transforms helpless victimization into meaningful sacrifice. The theory proposes that Kyle's martyrdom complex represents an attempt to redeem inherited trauma by giving suffering purpose. His ancestors died meaninglessly, murdered for existing. If Kyle suffers meaningfully, fighting for justice and protecting others, he retroactively justifies the survival that allowed him to exist. His willingness to sacrifice validates the survival of those who came before him. This psychological mechanism is common among descendants of trauma survivors. They feel guilty for existing when others died. They feel obligated to make their existence worthwhile, to justify the survival that their existence represents. Kyle's moral crusading becomes a way of earning his right to exist, of proving that his ancestors' survival was worthwhile because it led to him, someone who fights against the very injustices that killed them. Sheila's overprotection as trauma transmission. Sheila Broflovsky, Kyle's mother, is portrayed throughout the series as the archetypal, overprotective Jewish mother. She is anxious, controlling, and hypervigilant about potential threats to her family. She launches moral crusades that parallel Kyle's, attempting to control South Park's culture and protect children from influences she deems dangerous. Her most notable campaign, attempting to ban the Canadian comedy duo Terrence and Phillip for promoting vulgarity, escalates into international crisis. She is simultaneously protective and overbearing, loving and controlling, well-intentioned and destructive. According to the theory, Sheila represents the mechanism through which generational trauma is transmitted to Kyle. She did not experience the Holocaust or direct persecution, but she carries anxiety patterns inherited from her own parents and transmitted to her son. Sheila's overprotective behavior teaches Kyle that the world is dangerous and requires constant vigilance. Her moral crusading models for him that fighting against perceived wrongs is not optional but obligatory. Her anxiety communicates that threats are everywhere and must be actively resisted. Even when Sheila consciously believes she is protecting Kyle from specific harms, she is unconsciously teaching him the hypervigilance and hyperresponsibility that characterize trauma responses. The overprotective parenting style common among Jewish families, particularly those with Holocaust connections, has been studied extensively. Parents who experienced or whose parents experienced severe trauma often raise their children with heightened focus on safety, success, and preparation for potential persecution. They may not explicitly discuss the trauma, but their anxiety patterns communicate its presence. The children learn that danger is constant, that they must always be prepared, that they cannot trust the world to be safe. This creates the foundation for hyper-responsibility and moral crusading that Kyle exhibits. Sheila's crusading directly models Kyle's behavior. When she perceives something wrong, she must fix it regardless of whether she has the authority or ability to do so. She launches campaigns against companies, governments, and cultural forces because she believes she is responsible for preventing harm. Kyle has learned this pattern from her. The theory suggests that Sheila's overprotection and crusading are not simply personality traits, but expressions of inherited trauma passing from generation to generation. She transmits to Kyle the anxiety she inherited from her parents, who inherited it from theirs, creating an unbroken chain of trauma response that stretches back through time. Why Kyle takes everything personally. One of Kyle's most consistent characteristics is his tendency to personalize problems that are not actually about him. When something bad happens in South Park, even when it has no direct connection to him, Kyle reacts as though it is his personal responsibility to address it. When people suffer, he feels their pain as though it were his own. When injustice occurs, he experiences it as personal failure to have prevented it. This inability to maintain appropriate boundaries between himself and others' problems is not empathy in the normal sense. It is enmeshment, a trauma response where an individual cannot distinguish between their own responsibilities and others' issues. According to the theory, this personalization stems from Kyle's inherited sense of collective responsibility. Jewish identity traditionally emphasizes community and collective fate. The concept of communal responsibility appears throughout Jewish law and tradition. All Jews are responsible for one another. This creates strong social bonds and support systems, but it can also create burden of carrying everyone's problems as one's own. Kyle has internalized this to pathological degree. Every problem in South Park becomes his problem. Every instance of suffering requires his intervention. Every moral failure demands his response. He cannot separate himself from the community's issues because his identity is built on collective responsibility. This hyper-responsibility makes normal childhood impossible. Children should be able to focus on age-appropriate concerns like friendships, school, and play. They should not be carrying the weight of systemic injustice or feeling personally accountable for society's failures. But Kyle's inherited trauma response makes such normal childhood inaccessible to him. He has been programmed by generational transmission to feel responsible for preventing suffering, to take every instance of injustice personally, to believe that if he does not fight, he is complicit. The theory explains Kyle's constant stress and frustration as consequences of this impossible burden. He is trying to carry weight no 10-year-old should carry, to fulfill responsibilities he cannot possibly fulfill, to prevent suffering he has no power to prevent. When he inevitably fails, when his crusades do not solve South Park's problems, when people continue to suffer despite his best efforts, Kyle experiences this as personal failure. He should have tried harder, fought smarter, done more. The fact that he is a child with no real power is irrelevant to his trauma-programmed sense of responsibility. He must save everyone because allowing anyone to suffer means failing in his inherited obligation to prevent persecution and protect the vulnerable. The weight of being the good one. In South Park's moral landscape, Kyle occupies a unique position. He is recognized by other characters, both children and adults, as the moral center, the one who can be counted on to do the right thing, the voice of reason and ethics in situations of moral confusion. This recognition might seem like validation or honor, but according to the theory, it represents crushing psychological burden. Being designated the good one means Kyle must constantly prove that goodness exists, that moral behavior is possible, that hope for humanity is justified. If Kyle fails, if he gives in to cynicism or cruelty or selfishness, what hope remains? His role as moral center makes him responsible, not just for his own behavior, but for demonstrating that ethical action is possible at all. This is unsustainable pressure for an adult, let alone a child. Kyle must maintain moral consistency while everyone around him behaves badly. He must fight for justice while watching injustice prevail. He must believe in the possibility of change while evidence constantly suggests nothing changes. He must hold himself to impossible standards because he is the proof that those standards can be met. The theory proposes that this role gradually destroys Kyle. The weight of being sole moral guardian in morally bankrupt environment is more than any person can carry indefinitely. Kyle's occasional breakdowns and moments of moral compromise are not character flaws. They are inevitable results of being asked to carry more than human psychology can sustain. When Kyle does break, when he acts out of anger or makes ethically questionable choices, he experiences profound guilt that goes beyond normal remorse. He has not simply made a mistake, he has failed in his designated role, proven that even he cannot maintain moral standards, potentially confirmed that goodness is impossible. This guilt feeds back into his hyper-responsibility, creating a vicious cycle. Kyle must be good to justify the weight of responsibility he carries. The weight of responsibility makes being good nearly impossible. When he fails to be good, he feels more guilty, which increases the pressure, which makes failure more likely. The cycle continues without resolution because Kyle's role as the good one is built into his identity and reinforced by the community around him. Kyle Broflovsky carries the weight of history every time he stands up for what is right. His moral crusades are not simply about South Park's problems. They are about justifying centuries of survival, proving that his ancestors' suffering meant something, demonstrating that good can triumph if only he fights hard enough. The tragedy is that no 10-year-old should carry the weight of generational trauma transmitted through culture, family, and identity. But Kyle has no choice. His Jewish identity connects him inextricably to history of persecution and genocide. This history has created in him psychological patterns that make moral passivity impossible, that turn every instance of injustice into personal obligation, that transform childhood into endless series of battles he cannot win. Kyle will fight forever because stopping means admitting the suffering was meaningless, because resting means allowing persecution to succeed, because giving up means betraying everyone who died so that he could exist. His crusading is not choice. It is inherited obligation, written into his psychology, transmitted across generations, inescapable as his DNA. The weight will never lift because the history that created it can never be undone. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Eric Cartman, the sociopathic genius theory. Eric Cartman, the sociopathic genius theory. Eric Cartman is generally understood as the antagonist of South Park, the badly behaved child whose selfishness, cruelty, and bigotry drive much of the show's conflict. He is overweight, obnoxious, manipulative, and generally perceived as the show's villain, the source of its most offensive jokes and morally reprehensible scenarios. His behavior is typically dismissed as cartoon exaggeration, the necessary extreme character who pushes boundaries and creates conflict for comedic purposes. But examination of Cartman's actual accomplishments throughout the series reveals something far more disturbing than simple bad behavior. Eric Cartman consistently achieves outcomes that should be impossible for an 8-year-old child. He creates functioning businesses, manipulates government agencies, orchestrates elaborate psychological operations, and demonstrates strategic planning that would challenge adult professionals. These are not lucky accidents or cartoon logic moments. They are systematic demonstrations of extraordinary intelligence deployed with ruthless efficiency. According to a deeply unsettling theory, Cartman is not simply a badly behaved child who needs discipline and consequences. He is a genuine sociopath with genius-level intellect, and his lack of empathy is not character flaw, but diagnostic criterion for a severe personality disorder that will only worsen as he ages. The impossible accomplishments. The evidence for Cartman's extraordinary capabilities begins with cataloging what he has actually achieved. In the episode Cartmanland, he inherits $1 million from his grandmother and uses the money to purchase a defunct amusement park. This alone demonstrates financial sophistication beyond any normal child. He navigates inheritance processes, real estate transactions, and legal transfers of property ownership. But the accomplishment extends further. Cartman then operates the theme park as a functioning business, managing maintenance, security, and operations. When financial pressures force him to hire employees and admit customers to generate revenue, he demonstrates understanding of business models, cash flow management, and operational overhead. The complexity of these activities is staggering. Running an amusement park requires coordinating multiple systems, managing staff, ensuring safety compliance, and balancing budgets. Adult professionals struggle with these challenges. An 8-year-old child should not be capable of any of it, let alone all of it simultaneously. The Crack Baby Athletic Association represents even more sophisticated operation. Cartman recognizes that watching crack-addicted babies fight over a ball could be monetized, then creates an entire organizational structure modeled on NCAA athletics. He establishes leagues, develops merchandising, negotiates broadcast rights, and manages public relations. The operation requires understanding of sports management, marketing, legal frameworks around exploitation and intellectual property, and media relations. Cartman handles all of these elements with competence that would impress business school graduates. He does not simply have a cruel idea. He executes multi-level plan requiring coordination of numerous moving parts, anticipation of obstacles, and adaptation when circumstances change. The Scott Tenorman incident stands as perhaps the most chilling demonstration of Cartman's capabilities. After being humiliated by a high school student, Cartman orchestrates a revenge plot of stunning complexity. He manipulates Scott's parents into a situation where they are killed, harvests their bodies for meat, cooks them into chili, tricks Scott into eating his own parents, then arranges for Scott's favorite band to witness the revelation and mock his grief. This plan requires predicting multiple people's behaviors, timing events precisely, maintaining operational security across numerous steps, and executing flawlessly under pressure. The psychological sophistication alone is extraordinary. Cartman had to understand Scott's emotional vulnerabilities, identify what would cause maximum suffering, and construct a scenario that would guarantee the desired psychological destruction. This is not child's thinking. This is the methodology of someone who studies human psychology systematically, understands how to break people psychologically, and has no moral restraints preventing implementation. The Coon and Friends franchise demonstrates Cartman's ability to create and manage complex organizations. He develops superhero personas, establishes team structures, creates merchandising plans, and attempts to monetize the franchise through various channels. This requires understanding of intellectual property development, brand management, team coordination, and business strategy. 8-year-old children playing superhero do not typically develop comprehensive business plans for their make-believe adventures. The theory proposes that these accomplishments cannot be explained by luck, by other characters' stupidity, or by cartoon logic. They represent systematic application of genius-level intelligence to achieve specific objectives. Cartman possesses intellectual capabilities far beyond normal human capacity for his age, possibly beyond normal adult capacity. He uses his intelligence without moral restraint, making him extraordinarily dangerous despite his age and appearance. Clinical sociopathy diagnosis. Sociopathy, also known as antisocial personality disorder, is characterized by specific diagnostic criteria established in psychiatric literature. The disorder manifests through patterns of behavior that violate social norms and others' rights. Core features include lack of empathy, inability to feel remorse, manipulative behavior, superficial charm, grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, and impulsivity combined with a long-term manipulation capability. Individuals with sociopathy do not experience guilt or emotional connection to others. They view people as objects to be used for their benefit. They feel no remorse for harm they cause because they do not recognize others as beings whose suffering matters. According to the theory, Eric Cartman exhibits every single diagnostic criterion for sociopathy with textbook precision. His lack of empathy is absolute and consistent across the entire series. He witnesses others' suffering, not with concern, but with satisfaction when that suffering serves his purposes, or amusement when it does not. In the Scott to Norman episode, he orchestrates the murder of a teenager's parents and feeds them to him, then expresses no remorse whatsoever. Instead, he experiences satisfaction at having achieved his revenge. This is not normal childhood cruelty. Normal children who hurt others feel guilt afterward, experience some recognition that they cause suffering, show remorse at least when confronted with consequences. Cartman feels nothing except pleasure at his successful manipulation. His manipulative behavior appears constantly throughout the series. He lies compulsively even when truth would serve his interests better. He manipulates his mother, his friends, teachers, government officials, and strangers with equal facility. He identifies what each person wants or fears, then exploits that knowledge to control their behavior. This manipulation is not impulsive or emotional. It is calculated and systematic. Cartman studies people, learns their vulnerabilities, and weaponizes that information. The superficial charm characteristic of sociopaths manifests in Cartman's ability to present himself as innocent, well-intentioned, or victimized when such presentation serves his purposes. He can adopt whatever persona the situation requires. When he needs adults to trust him, he becomes a sweet child seeking guidance. When he needs sympathy, he becomes the bullied victim. When he needs authority, he becomes the natural leader. None of these presentations reflect his actual nature. They are masks he wears to manipulate others' perceptions. His grandiose self-image persists despite constant evidence of his failures and limitations. Cartman genuinely believes he is superior to everyone around him, that he deserves special treatment, that rules do not apply to him. This grandiosity is not confidence or high self-esteem. It is delusional sense of superiority, characteristic of personality disorders. He cannot accurately assess his own abilities or limitations because his disorder prevents realistic self-evaluation. The pathological lying extends to situations where lying creates more problems than honesty would solve. Cartman lies reflexively, apparently for its own sake, rather than strategic benefit. This pattern indicates that lying has become automatic, a response rather than conscious choice. Sociopaths often lie compulsively because they do not value truth as concept and do not experience the social discomfort that normally prevents constant dishonesty. The diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder technically cannot be applied to children under age 18 because personality is still developing. However, the precursor diagnosis of conduct disorder can be applied to minors who exhibit the behavioral patterns that predict adult sociopathy. Cartman meets every criterion for conduct disorder and displays the persistent pattern of antisocial behavior that predicts he will develop full antisocial personality disorder as an adult. The theory is not claiming that Cartman might become a sociopath. It proposes that he already is one. that his personality disorder is fully formed despite his youth, and that what viewers witness across the series is textbook presentation of sociopathic child whose condition will only intensify as he matures. Leanne Cartman created the perfect sociopath. Personality disorders develop through combination of genetic predisposition and environmental factors. While some individuals may have biological vulnerability towards sociopathy, the disorder requires specific environmental conditions to manifest fully. The absence of boundaries, consistent discipline, and moral instruction during critical developmental periods creates the psychological conditions in which sociopathy flourishes. According to the theory, Leanne Cartman has provided the perfect environment for cultivating sociopathic personality in her son. Her parenting approach is characterized by complete permissiveness, total absence of boundaries, and absolute refusal to say no to Eric, regardless of how inappropriate or harmful his requests. When Cartman demands something, Leanne provides it. When he behaves badly, she makes excuses. When he should face consequences, she protects him. This is not simply ineffective parenting. It is sociopath factory. Children develop conscience and empathy through experiencing boundaries and consequences. When they hurt others, they should face disapproval and punishment that teaches them their actions have impacts. When they violate rules, they should experience negative outcomes that motivate future compliance. When they demand unreasonable things, they should hear no and learn to tolerate frustration. Cartman has experienced none of this. Leanne never says no. She never enforces boundaries. She never allows him to face natural consequences of his behavior. The result is that Cartman has never developed internal controls on his behavior. He has no conscience, because conscience develops through internalizing external rules and consequences. If external authority never enforces rules, there is nothing to internalize. He has no empathy, because empathy develops partly through experiencing how one's actions affect others and feeling motivated to avoid causing harm. If he never faces consequences for causing harm, he never learns to care about others' suffering. Leanne's permissiveness teaches Cartman that manipulation works, that he can get anything he wants through demanding, lying, or emotional manipulation, that other people exist to serve his needs. These lessons create the foundation of sociopathic worldview. The theory suggests that Leon's parenting is not just bad, but actively destructive in a specific way that cultivates personality disorder. Some background about Leanne deepens this analysis. The show has strongly implied that she works as prostitute or escort, with references to her involvement with the Denver Broncos and various other sexual encounters. This suggests unstable home environment, possible substance abuse issues, and exposure to adult sexuality and dysfunction at inappropriate age for Cartman. Additionally, Cartman's father is absent, identity unknown, or obscured depending on which episode's information is considered canonical. The absence of father figure means no male authority in Cartman's life, no one to provide structure that Leanne fails to provide. The combination creates perfect conditions for sociopathy development. Unstable environment teaches that the world is unpredictable and unreliable. Lack of boundaries teaches that rules do not apply. Permissive mother teaches that manipulation works. Absent father means no alternative authority figure. Exposure to adult dysfunction teaches that people are exploitable and relationships are transactional. Every element of Cartman's upbringing has contributed to creating his personality disorder. The tragedy, if there is tragedy in sociopath creation, is that Leanne genuinely loves Eric and believes she is being a good mother by giving him whatever he wants. She does not recognize that her permissiveness is destroying his development. She interprets his manipulations as normal childhood behavior rather than emerging personality disorder. She thinks protecting him from consequences demonstrates maternal love rather than enabling his worst traits. The theory proposes that if Cartman had been raised in a structured environment with consistent boundaries and appropriate discipline, his genetic predisposition towards sociopathy might not have fully manifested. But Leon's parenting ensured that every predisposition was activated and reinforced until his personality disorder became fixed and permanent. Manipulation tactics beyond child capability. The sophistication of Cartman's manipulation deserves detailed examination because it reveals intelligence and psychological understanding far beyond normal childhood capacity. Children manipulate in simple ways. They lie about who started fights. They fake illness to avoid school. They play parents against each other. These manipulations are transparent to observant adults and rely on adults' willingness to believe children's innocence. Cartman's manipulations are categorically different. He employs advanced psychological tactics that adult manipulators use, techniques that require understanding of human psychology at a level that should be impossible for an 8-year-old. Gaslighting is a manipulation tactic, where the manipulator makes victims question their own perception of reality. The manipulator denies obvious facts, insists that events did not happen as the victim remembers, and presents alternative narrative with such confidence that the victim begins doubting their own memory and judgment. Cartman uses this tactic repeatedly. He denies doing things that others witnessed him do, insists that events happened differently than they did, and maintains his false narrative with such conviction that people begin questioning whether they misremembered. This is not simple lying. This is systematic psychological manipulation designed to undermine others' confidence in their own perception. Triangulation involves manipulator positioning themselves between two other people and controlling information flow to create conflict between them while maintaining control. Cartman does this constantly, telling different stories to different people, creating situations where his friends turn against each other while he remains positioned as ally to both sides. This requires tracking multiple deceptions simultaneously, predicting how information will flow between parties, and managing complex social dynamics. Adult manipulators struggle with this. 8-year-old executing it successfully demonstrates extraordinary capability. Love bombing followed by withdrawal is classic abuser tactic. The manipulator provides excessive attention and affection to create dependency, then withdraws it to create anxiety and increased need for approval. The victim becomes focused on regaining the manipulator's approval, giving the manipulator control. Cartman uses this with his friends, particularly with Butters. He oscillates between treating someone as best friend and treating them as worthless, creating emotional dependency and control. Strategic appeals to different motivations demonstrate Cartman's understanding of human psychology. When manipulating authority figures, he appeals to their desire to help children or their fear of appearing unreasonable. When manipulating peers, he appeals to their insecurities or desires for social acceptance. When manipulating his mother, he appeals to guilt and maternal instinct. He does not use same approach with everyone. He analyzes each target and deploys the manipulation most likely to succeed with that specific person. These tactics require metacognitive understanding of how human minds work. Cartman must understand not just what people think, but how they think, what cognitive biases they have, what emotional vulnerabilities can be exploited. This is theory of mind, taken to extreme level. Most children his age are developing basic theory of mind, understanding that others have different knowledge and perspectives than they do. Cartman has advanced theory of mind that allows him to model others' psychological processes and predict how they will respond to various manipulations. The theory proposes that this capability is not learned through normal childhood social development. It represents either innate gift for psychological manipulation, suggesting his sociopathy includes unusual cognitive advantages, or systematic study of human weakness that Cartman has undertaken as project. Either explanation indicates that Cartman is operating at intellectual and psychological level far beyond his years, making him extraordinarily dangerous despite his apparent harmlessness as obese elementary school student. The empathy vacuum. Perhaps the most diagnostic evidence for Cartman's sociopathy is his complete and total absence of genuine empathy. Across the entire series, Cartman has never displayed authentic concern for another person's suffering. He has faked empathy when doing so served his purposes. He has mimicked appropriate emotional responses to manipulate others. But he has never experienced actual empathy, never felt genuine distress at someone else's pain, never acted to help others without ulterior motive. This is not occasional cruelty or selective empathy. This is diagnostic absence of the neurological and psychological capacity for empathy that characterizes sociopathy. When Cartman witnesses suffering, his response depends entirely on whether that suffering affects his interests. If someone's pain can be useful to him, he exploits it. If it is irrelevant to him, he ignores it. If it entertains him, he enjoys it. What he never does is feel concern for the suffering person as a person. The Scott to Norman incident provides the clearest example. After feeding Scott his parents in Chile, Cartman witnesses Scott's complete psychological breakdown. Scott collapses in grief and horror. He screams, cries, and experiences trauma that will likely affect him for life. Cartman's response is pure satisfaction. He feels no remorse, no concern, no recognition that he has caused a human being to suffer catastrophically. He has achieved his goal of revenge and feels only pleasure at his success. This is not normal childhood cruelty. Children can be cruel, but they typically feel some discomfort when confronted with the full weight of suffering they caused. They may justify their actions, may suppress their guilt, but the capacity for guilt exists. Cartman demonstrates no capacity for guilt whatsoever. The suffering he causes does not affect him emotionally, except when it threatens his self-interest. Throughout various episodes, Cartman's friends, teachers, parents, and even strangers experience hardship, loss, and pain. Cartman's response is consistent indifference, unless their situation can be exploited. He does not comfort friends who are upset. He does not help people in need unless helping serves his purposes. He does not avoid causing pain to others. His decision-making process simply does not include consideration of others' feelings or well-being as factors that matter. The theory identifies this as the core diagnostic feature of his sociopathy. Sociopaths are not people who struggle with empathy or who have limited empathy. They are people who do not have empathy at all. They intellectually understand that others experience emotions, but they do not feel those emotions vicariously. They do not experience the automatic, shared emotional state that makes most humans instinctively care about others' suffering. Cartman intellectually understands that people get sad, angry, or hurt. He uses this intellectual understanding to manipulate them, but he does not feel what they feel. He does not experience their emotions as his emotions. He is fundamentally separate from normal human emotional connection. This empathy vacuum has profound implications for Cartman's future development. Empathy is the foundation of moral behavior for most humans. People avoid harming others partly because they feel bad when others suffer. They help others partly because they feel good when others feel good. Without empathy, these motivations do not exist. Cartman has no internal reason to avoid harming others beyond concern for consequences to himself. If he can harm someone without facing consequences, he has no moral restraint preventing him from doing so. As Cartman ages and gains more capability, this absence of empathy combined with his intelligence makes him increasingly dangerous. He will develop more sophisticated methods for avoiding consequences while inflicting harm. He will learn to hide his nature better, to present convincing facade of normal emotional responses. But the empathy will never develop because the neurological and psychological capacity for it is absent. The theory proposes that Cartman is not simply a child who needs to learn kindness. He is someone who is incapable of genuine kindness because the emotional foundation that produces kindness does not exist in him. Why others don't see the danger. Despite Cartman's extensive history of manipulation, cruelty, and sociopathic behavior, the people around him generally fail to recognize him as genuinely dangerous. His friends continue associating with him despite being his frequent victims. Adults dismiss his behavior as childish misbehavior rather than personality disorder. The town of South Park seems unable to recognize that one of its children is actually a threat. According to the theory, this failure to recognize Cartman's danger is part of how sociopaths operate successfully in society. They exploit social expectations and cognitive biases that make people underestimate them. The most powerful protection Cartman has is his age. Adults have deep-seated assumption that children are innocent, that child misbehavior is developmental phase, that even badly behaved children will grow out of it with proper guidance. This assumption makes adults interpret Cartman's sociopathic behavior as immaturity rather than personality disorder. When he manipulates, adults think he is being clever in normal child way. When he lies, they think he is going through dishonest phase. When he hurts others, they think he has not yet learned empathy. The possibility that he is incapable of learning empathy, that his behavior represents fixed personality disorder rather than developmental stage, does not occur to them because it contradicts their fundamental beliefs about childhood. Child sociopaths are particularly dangerous precisely because adults are predisposed not to recognize them as dangerous. The diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder cannot officially be applied to children, not because children cannot have the disorder, but because mental health professionals resist pathologizing childhood behavior. This resistance, while well-intentioned, creates blindness to genuine cases where personality disorder has developed early. Cartman benefits from this blindness. His friends have become desensitized to his behavior. The first few times Cartman did something terrible, they were shocked and angry. But after years of constant exposure to his manipulation and cruelty, they have normalized it. This is how abusive relationships function. People adapt to abuse over time. Their baseline expectations shift, and behavior that should alarm them instead becomes familiar and tolerable. Stan, Kyle, and Kenny have been exposed to Cartman's sociopathy for so long that they no longer recognize how abnormal it is. They think this is just how Cartman is, accepting his nature rather than recognizing it as diagnostic of serious disorder. Additionally, the intermittent reinforcement Cartman provides maintains their relationships with him. He is not cruel 100% of the time. Occasionally, he engages in activities with them that are fun. Sometimes, he helps them with schemes. These positive interactions, scattered among the cruelty, create confusion about his nature. If Cartman were consistently terrible, his friends would simply stop associating with him. But the occasional positive interactions make them believe that maybe he is not so bad. Maybe he can change. Maybe underneath the cruelty is someone capable of friendship. The theory proposes that this is exactly how sociopaths maintain relationships. They provide just enough positive interaction to keep their victims engaged while continuing their exploitation. The victims keep hoping that the person will become the better version they occasionally glimpse, not recognizing that the better version is manipulation and the cruel version is authentic. The broader South Park community also fails to recognize Cartman's danger because he has not yet done anything that forced them to acknowledge it. His worst actions either have been hidden or have been dismissed as childish pranks, despite their severity. The Scott Tenorman incident, for example, apparently was never reported to authorities or investigated. The Crack Baby organization was eventually shut down, but without serious consequences for Cartman. He has managed to avoid the kind of definitive exposure that would force adults to confront what he is. This pattern will likely continue as Cartman ages. Sociopaths are skilled at avoiding consequences, at maintaining plausible deniability, at presenting themselves as misunderstood or victimized when confronted. Cartman will refine these skills as he matures. By the time he is adult, he will be expert at hiding his nature from everyone except his victims. The long-term planning. The sophistication of Cartman's planning capabilities provides additional evidence for his genius-level intelligence. Children are typically impulsive, focused on immediate gratification, unable to maintain complex plans across extended time periods. Their prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and impulse control, is still developing. They struggle with delayed gratification, with maintaining effort toward distant goals, with coordinating multiple steps towards single objective. Cartman demonstrates none of these limitations. His plans extend across weeks or months. He maintains operational security throughout extended operations. He adapts to changing circumstances without abandoning his goals. He thinks multiple steps ahead, predicting how others will respond to his actions and preparing contingencies. The Scott Tenorman revenge exemplifies this capability. After being humiliated, Cartman did not respond impulsively with immediate retaliation. He planned for extended period, orchestrating multiple elements. He had to arrange for the Tenormen's death, acquire their bodies, process them into meat, prepare the chili, invite Scott to ChiliCon Carnival, ensure Scott would eat the chili, and coordinate Radiohead's presence for maximum psychological impact. Each step required careful timing and execution. One mistake would have ruined the entire plan. Cartman executed flawlessly, demonstrating planning capacity that exceeds most adults. The Crack Baby organization required sustained effort across what appears to be weeks or months. Cartman had to develop the concept, recruit participants, establish organizational structure, create marketing, materials, negotiate with television networks, and manage ongoing operations. This is not a weekend project. This is sustained commitment to a long-term goal requiring daily management and adjustment. Children do not typically maintain this level of focus. They get bored, distracted, interested in other things. Cartman pursues his goals with persistence that suggests adult executive function. His ability to wait for the perfect moment to strike demonstrates patience incompatible with a normal child psychology. In multiple episodes, Cartman endures temporary setbacks or humiliations because he recognizes that immediate response would be less effective than waiting for optimal opportunity. This is not natural for children, who typically prioritize immediate emotional satisfaction over strategic advantage. Cartman consistently prioritizes strategy over immediate gratification, suggesting his thinking operates on a different timeline than other children. The theory proposes several possible explanations for this capability. First, sociopathy may provide certain cognitive advantages despite its moral deficits. The lack of empathy means Cartman is not distracted by emotional responses that might interfere with cold calculation. Normal people experience emotional reactions that color their judgment. Cartman does not. This allows purely strategic thinking unclouded by feelings. Second, Cartman may have consciously developed planning skills as survival mechanism in an environment he cannot control through normal means. As overweight child with no father and unreliable mother, he lacks conventional sources of power. Planning and manipulation become his tools for exerting control over environment and other people. Third, and most disturbing, Cartman may simply be extraordinarily intelligent in ways unrelated to his sociopathy. His personality disorder makes him dangerous. His genius makes him catastrophically dangerous. The combination of these traits creates someone capable of extraordinary harm because he has both the intelligence to plan complex operations and the lack of moral restraint that would prevent normal genius from deploying their capabilities for evil purposes. Whatever the explanation, Cartman's long-term planning ability is inconsistent with normal child psychology and consistent with adult-level strategic thinking. As he ages and gains more knowledge, resources, and social freedom, this capability will make him increasingly dangerous. He will be able to pursue more ambitious goals, manage more complex operations, and inflict greater harm because his planning skills will continue developing while his empathy remains permanently absent. The escalation pattern. Examining Cartman's behavior across South Park's 20-plus seasons reveals a disturbing pattern of escalation. His schemes and actions in early seasons, while selfish and cruel, were relatively contained in scope and severity. He manipulated his friends for petty advantages. He lied to get what he wanted. He demonstrated selfishness and lack of concern for others. These behaviors were consistent with badly socialized child. As the series progressed, Cartman's actions became darker and more extreme. The Scott Tenorman revenge involved orchestrating murder and psychological torture. The Crack Baby organization exploited helpless infants for profit. Various plots have involved attempted genocide, torture, and mass manipulation. The severity and scope of his schemes have increased consistently over time. This pattern matches sociopathic escalation. Sociopaths do not maintain static level of antisocial behavior. They escalate. Each successful manipulation emboldens more extreme behavior. Each consequence-free action expands their sense of what they can get away with. The absence of internal moral restraints combined with the reinforcement from successful schemes creates conditions for escalation. Cartman has faced remarkably few serious consequences for his actions. His mother does not discipline him. His friends remain reluctantly associated with him. Adults dismiss his behavior. Authorities do not intervene. Each time he does something terrible and faces no meaningful consequence, he learns that he can do more extreme things without danger to himself. The theory proposes that this escalation pattern will continue and likely accelerate as Cartman ages. In early seasons, his goals were self-centered but relatively mundane: getting candy, avoiding school, winning games. In middle seasons, his goals became more ambitious: running businesses, orchestrating elaborate revenges, manipulating institutions. In recent seasons, his goals have included social and political control, ethnic cleansing, and destruction of people and systems that oppose him. The trajectory points toward increasingly dangerous objectives as his capabilities and ambitions grow. Cartman is not simply learning from experience and becoming more sophisticated. He is following the developmental path of untreated sociopath whose personality disorder solidifies and intensifies over time. The question the theory raises is not whether Cartman will eventually do something catastrophic. The question is when and how severe it will be. His pattern suggests he is building towards something much worse than what he has already done. Each scheme is practice for the next. Each success teaches him lessons about human psychology, social manipulation, and institutional vulnerabilities. He is accumulating knowledge and skills that will enable increasingly ambitious and destructive actions. Unlike normal children who develop more restraints as they mature, Cartman will develop only better methods for achieving his desires without consequence. His intelligence will increase, his knowledge will expand, his social skills will improve, but his empathy will never develop. The combination will make him extraordinarily dangerous as an adult. The most chilling aspect of this escalation is that it remains largely invisible to the people around him. They notice that Cartman does terrible things, but they do not recognize the pattern of escalation or its implications. They treat each incident as isolated event rather than data point in progression towards something worse. The theory suggests that by the time Cartman's true danger becomes undeniable, it will be too late to prevent the catastrophic outcome toward which he is building. Why this theory makes sense. The sociopathic genius theory provides comprehensive explanation for numerous aspects of Cartman's character that otherwise appear inconsistent or unrealistic. It accounts for how an 8-year-old accomplishes things that should be impossible for children. It explains why he shows no character growth or moral development across 20+ seasons, despite experiencing events that should teach him lessons. It makes sense of his total lack of remorse and empathy as clinical symptoms rather than exaggerated personality traits. It reframes his intelligence from cartoon genius to diagnostic indicator of the cognitive capabilities that make sociopaths so dangerous. The theory is supported by actual clinical criteria for antisocial personality disorder and conduct disorder. Cartman is not vaguely sociopathic or casually cruel. He exhibits specific diagnostic symptoms with precision that suggest the show's creators understand the condition's actual clinical presentation. Every behavior pattern that defines sociopathy appears in Cartman's actions. The consistency and comprehensiveness of his sociopathic presentation goes beyond coincidence or characterization convenience. It suggests deliberate portrayal of personality disorder. Reinterpreting the show's comedy through this lens transforms perception of what is being presented. The Scott Tenorman episode is not dark comedy about revenge. It is documentary of sociopath destroying someone psychologically. The Crack Baby organization is not satire about exploitation. It is depiction of sociopath recognizing and acting on opportunity for exploitation without moral restraint. Every Cartman-centric episode becomes evidence of personality disorder rather than humorous exaggeration. This reinterpretation makes South Park significantly darker because viewers are watching a genuine sociopath develop and escalate without intervention. The comedy comes from other characters failing to recognize the danger, from adults dismissing serious warning signs, from the community's inability or unwillingness to confront what Cartman is. The humor disguises the horror of watching a child with severe personality disorder become progressively more dangerous, while everyone around him enables his escalation. Eric Cartman is not a badly behaved child who needs discipline. He is a genuine sociopath whose genius-level intelligence makes him one of the most dangerous people in South Park despite his age. The comedy of South Park comes from adults dismissing him as just a child, while he systematically manipulates entire systems to serve his desires. The tragedy, if there is tragedy in sociopath creation, is that everyone around him is complicit in his development. Leon's permissive parenting created the perfect environment for sociopathy to flourish. His friend's desensitization enables his escalation. Adults' refusal to recognize diagnostic warning signs allows him to continue without intervention. Every episode where Cartman faces no consequences is another step in his evolution towards something truly monstrous. Sociopaths do not develop empathy. They do not learn remorse. They only learn better manipulation tactics. Every year, Cartman ages brings him closer to full adult capability, combined with his existing lack of moral restraint. In 20 years, Cartman will not be recognized monster like obvious villains. He will be successful professional, possibly in position of power, his sociopathy hidden beneath practiced facade of normalcy. He will have learned to mimic human emotion convincingly enough that casual observers will not recognize what he is. But the victims he creates will know. They will understand too late that the charming, successful person they trusted was predator who never felt anything genuine for them at all. And by then, his capabilities will have expanded to match his ambitions. The 8-year-old who orchestrated murder and psychological torture will have become the adult with resources, freedom, and skills to cause harm on scale that his childhood schemes only hinted at. The real question is not whether Cartman is sociopathic genius. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The question is what will happen when he reaches adulthood with his intelligence fully developed and his personality disorder fully entrenched. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Kenny McCormick, the Cursed Immortal Theory. Kenny McCormick, the Cursed Immortal Theory. Kenny McCormick dies in almost every episode of South Park's early seasons. He is crushed, burned, dismembered, shot, electrocuted, and killed in countless creative ways. Each death is played for dark comedy, with the other characters reacting with the now famous line, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny," followed by, "You bastards." Then the next episode begins, and Kenny is alive again, standing with his friends as though nothing happened. For years, this running gag was understood as exactly that, a gag, cartoon logic that allowed the show to kill a character repeatedly for comedic effect without permanent consequences. But the show eventually revealed something that transforms this running joke into something far darker. Kenny's deaths and resurrections are not cartoon convention. They are real within the show's universe. Kenny genuinely dies, experiences actual death, and is reborn into the same life over and over in an endless cycle. More disturbingly, Kenny remembers every single death. He carries the accumulated trauma of hundreds of deaths in his child psychology, while everyone around him forgets he died as soon as he is reborn. The theory proposes that Kenny's constant deaths are not random misfortune, but the result of a supernatural curse placed on him through his parents' involvement with the cult. This curse has made Kenny functionally immortal, but immortality in his case is not gift. It is the most horrific punishment imaginable, and the psychological damage from dying repeatedly while remaining completely alone in that knowledge has fundamentally destroyed his ability to function as normal human being. The curse made canonical. The transformation of Kenny's deaths from running gag to canonical reality occurred in the Coon and Friends trilogy, specifically in the episodes Mysterion Rises and Coon vs. Coon and Friends. These episodes did not simply acknowledge Kenny's deaths as something unusual. They explicitly established Kenny's immortality as supernatural curse with specific origin and mechanics. Kenny reveals to his friends that he cannot die permanently. Every time he is killed, he wakes up the next morning in his bed, as though nothing happened. No one remembers his death. His parents do not remember giving birth to him again. His friends do not remember watching him die. The world resets around him, but Kenny himself retains all memories of every death he has experienced. The show established that this curse stems from Kenny's parents' involvement in a cult of Cthulhu. During one of their cult meetings, while Kenny's mother was pregnant with him, some ritual or supernatural event occurred that bound Kenny to this cycle of death and rebirth. The show does not provide complete details about the mechanics or purpose of the curse, but it confirms that the curse is real, that it results from supernatural forces connected to his parents' cult activities, and that Kenny has no ability to break it. This revelation recontextualizes the entire series. Every death viewers witnessed in previous seasons was not cartoon joke, but actual death that Kenny experienced and remembered. The comedy of his deaths becomes horror when understood as real experiences that a child has endured hundreds of times. The casual nature of the deaths, often played as throwaway gags at episodes' ends, becomes disturbing when recognized as documentation of repeated trauma. The show made explicit what had previously been implicit. Kenny's situation is not funny when examined from his perspective. According to the theory, the curse's canonization was not simply creative decision to add depth to running gag. It was acknowledgement of what the deaths had always meant for Kenny as character. If he exists as person within South Park's universe, if he has consciousness and experiences, then he must experience his deaths as real events. The psychological implications of this were always present. The show's decision to make the curse explicit simply brought those accurate implications into focus. Kenny has been suffering extraordinary psychological torture since birth, and almost no one knows or cares, because almost no one remembers. The memory that won't die. The curse's most devastating aspect is not the dying itself, but the remembering. If Kenny died and was reborn with no memory of his deaths, the curse would still be disturbing, but would lack the psychological torture component. He would experience each death as his first and only death. Traumatic certainly, but not accumulating. The reality is far worse. Kenny remembers every death with perfect clarity. He carries the memory of being burned alive, crushed by falling objects, shot through the head, torn apart by animals, electrocuted, frozen, drowned, and killed in hundreds of other ways. Each death becomes permanent part of his memory, even though the physical consequences disappear with his resurrection. Most human beings die once. That single death is the end of their consciousness and experience. They do not carry forward trauma from dying because there is no forward to carry it to. Kenny dies repeatedly and carries the trauma of each death into his next life. This is psychological torture of extraordinary severity. A single traumatic death would be enough to psychologically destroy most adults. Kenny has experienced hundreds of traumatic deaths, and he is 10 years old. The human mind is not designed to process death, particularly not violent death, particularly not one's own death. People who survive near-death experiences often develop post-traumatic stress disorder from single brush with mortality. They experience intrusive memories, nightmares, anxiety, and fundamental changes to their worldview. Kenny has not had near-death experiences. He has had actual death experiences, repeatedly, and he has no access to trauma therapy or psychiatric care that might help him process these experiences. His mind has been forced to contain memories that exceed human psychological capacity to manage. The theory proposes that Kenny's entire personality and behavior pattern can be understood as trauma response to accumulated death memories. He is not simply child who dies frequently. He is child whose psychology has been shattered by experiencing more death than soldiers in combat, more than murder victims, more than anyone should be capable of experiencing while maintaining consciousness. But the curse keeps him conscious. It forces him to continue experiencing, remembering, living with the weight of all those deaths. The isolation of this experience compounds the trauma exponentially. When someone experiences trauma, one of the most important factors in recovery is social support. Being able to talk about the experience, having others acknowledge what happened, feeling understood and supported. These elements help traumatized individuals process their experiences and begin healing. Kenny has none of this. No one remembers his deaths except him. He cannot talk about them because people think he is crazy or lying. His friends do not remember watching him die. His parents do not remember their son dying. The world provides him no acknowledgement, no support, no validation that what he experienced was real. This creates a particular form of psychological torture where the victim's reality is constantly invalidated. Kenny knows what happened. He has the memories. But everyone around him denies that reality, not through malice, but through the curse's mechanism that erases their memories. Kenny is utterly alone with his trauma. He cannot share it. He cannot process it through relationship. He can only carry it silently while maintaining a facade of normalcy that allows him to function in social world that does not remember his suffering. Why Kenny cannot speak. Clearly. Kenny's most recognizable characteristic is his muffled, incomprehensible speech. He wears an orange parka with the hood pulled up tightly, obscuring most of his face and muffling his voice. His friends and others occasionally understand what he says, suggesting he is speaking normally under the hood. But to viewers, and often to characters in the show, his speech is indecipherable. This has been played primarily for comedy. Kenny says something outrageous or insightful, but no one can understand him. The theory proposes that Kenny's muffled speech is not simply character design choice or running gag. It is trauma response, a physical manifestation of the psychological damage caused by repeated death and complete social isolation in that experience. Dissociation is psychological defense mechanism that occurs when someone experiences trauma too severe for their mind to process normally. The mind essentially disconnects from the experience, creating distance between the conscious self and the traumatic event. People who dissociate report feeling disconnected from their bodies, watching themselves from outside, feeling like events are happening to someone else, or experiencing the world as unreal. Dissociation protects the psyche by preventing full integration of unbearable experience. Kenny's muffled speech can be understood as chronic dissociation made physical. He has experienced so much trauma, accumulated so many deaths, carried so much pain alone, that he has partially dissociated from the world as defense mechanism. The hood he pulls tightly around his face is not just clothing. It is physical barrier he places between himself and reality. By muffling his voice, by obscuring his face, by creating a layer of separation between himself and others, Kenny maintains psychological distance that makes continued existence possible. If he fully engaged with the world, if he allowed himself to be completely present and connected, the weight of his accumulated trauma might destroy him. The dissociation allows him to continue functioning by keeping him somewhat removed from full emotional engagement with his experiences. The theory also proposes that Kenny's muffled speech serves another psychological function. It prevents deep connection with others. Connection requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires trust that the relationship will persist. But Kenny knows that every time he dies, all his relationships reset. His friends forget him. Any emotional connection he formed disappears from their memories. They wake up the next day, and he is simply their friend Kenny, with no memory of whatever intimacy or sharing might have occurred before his death. This makes genuine emotional connection pointless and painful. Why open up to someone when they will forget? Why form deep bonds when they will be erased? The muffled speech keeps relationships superficial by making real communication difficult. If people cannot understand what Kenny says, they cannot get close to him emotionally. He remains on the periphery of the social group, present but not fully integrated, participating but not fully engaged. This protects him from the pain of forming attachments that he knows will be erased by his next death. It is not conscious choice necessarily. It is psychological defense that has manifested in physical symptom. His trauma has literally made it difficult for him to speak clearly to others, because speaking clearly would mean risk of connection, and connection means risk of loss, and loss is guaranteed every time he dies. Better to remain muffled, obscured, slightly removed from full participation in social world. The pain of isolation is more bearable than the pain of repeatedly forming and losing connections that only he remembers. The poverty connection. The McCormick family is consistently portrayed as the poorest family in South Park. They live in a dilapidated house. Kenny's parka is worn and dirty. His parents are unemployed alcoholics who fight constantly. The family struggles with basic necessities. Food is scarce. The living conditions are dangerous. Kenny and his siblings live in an environment of severe neglect and material deprivation. This poverty is typically played for dark comedy, but the theory proposes deeper connection between Kenny's curse and his family's economic situation. According to the theory, the curse does not only affect Kenny, it has damned his entire family. The supernatural forces that bound Kenny to eternal death and rebirth also bound the McCormick family to poverty and dysfunction. This is part of the curse's punishment. Kenny must die repeatedly, and his family must exist in conditions of severe deprivation, trapped in circumstances they cannot escape no matter what they do. The curse prevents any real improvement or escape from their situation. This interpretation is supported by the persistent, unchanging nature of the McCormick family's poverty. In South Park, other families experience ups and downs. They have good and bad periods. Circumstances change. But the McCormicks remain trapped in identical poverty across the entire series. They do not improve. They do not escape. They exist in frozen state of deprivation that never shifts despite any efforts they might make. This stasis suggests something more than simple economic hardship. It suggests supernatural entrapment. The parents' alcoholism and dysfunction can be understood as responses to their cursed circumstances. They are trapped in poverty they cannot escape, burdened with curse they do not fully understand, unable to break free from supernatural forces that control their lives. They turn to alcohol to numb the hopelessness. They fight because they are frustrated and powerless. They neglect their children because they are overwhelmed by their own suffering. The curse has destroyed the entire family, not just Kenny. For Kenny, growing up in poverty adds material suffering to his psychological suffering. He experiences hunger, cold, danger, and deprivation on top of dying repeatedly. His basic physical needs are not met even between deaths. He cannot find refuge from his curse in comfortable home or supportive family. He is trapped in every way, cursed to die and be reborn eternally, cursed to remember every death, cursed to live in poverty that ensures continued suffering even when he is alive. The curse is comprehensive in its cruelty. The theory suggests that this is intentional. The supernatural forces that created Kenny's curse were not simply preventing him from dying permanently. They were ensuring maximum suffering by trapping him and his family in conditions that make every life between deaths as difficult as possible. Kenny's immortality is not neutral state of existing forever. It is eternal punishment, where death brings temporary escape, followed by rebirth into continued hardship. Mysterion. They attempt to control the uncontrollable. Kenny's creation of the Mysterion superhero identity represents his attempt to weaponize his curse, to transform the source of his suffering into source of power. Mysterion's key ability is that he cannot die permanently, exactly Kenny's curse. As Mysterion, Kenny positions himself as perfect superhero because death, the ultimate threat that limits other heroes, cannot stop him. He can take risks no one else can take. He can sacrifice himself knowing he will return. His curse becomes tactical advantage. But the theory proposes that Mysterion is more than clever use of existing curse. It is desperate psychological attempt to gain sense of control over something that has controlled him completely since birth. Kenny has no power over his curse. He cannot prevent his deaths. He cannot control when or how he will die. He cannot break the cycle or choose to stay dead. The curse dominates his entire existence, and he is completely helpless to affect it. This helplessness is psychologically devastating. Human beings need sense of agency, feeling that they have some control over their lives and circumstances. Kenny has no agency regarding the most fundamental aspect of his existence, Creating Mysterion gives Kenny illusion of agency. If he is superhero whose power is immunity to permanent death, then his curse becomes his choice, his tool, his power. He is not helpless victim of supernatural force. He is hero who uses that force strategically. This reframing is psychologically necessary for him to continue functioning. If he fully accepts his helplessness, if he acknowledges that he is completely powerless victim of curse, he cannot control or escape. The psychological weight might be unbearable. Mysterion allows him to pretend he has chosen this, that he is using the curse rather than being used by it. But this is ultimately illusion. Kenny is not actually in control. He is still dying randomly. He is still being reborn without choice. He is still carrying the trauma of every death. Mysterion does not change any of that. It simply provides psychological framework that makes the helplessness slightly more bearable by pretending it is power. The theory identifies this as trauma coping mechanism. Traumatized individuals often try to reframe their trauma as something meaningful or purposeful, because random, meaningless suffering is harder to bear than suffering that serves some purpose. If Kenny can believe his curse makes him superhero, if he can believe the deaths serve heroic purpose, then maybe the suffering is not meaningless. Maybe he is not just victim, but warrior. Maybe the pain has point. But Kenny knows at some level that this is not true. Mysterion is fantasy, he tells himself. The curse remains curse. The deaths remain traumatic. The rebirth remains trap. No matter how he reframes it, he cannot escape the fundamental reality that he is caught in a cycle of suffering over which he has no genuine control. His attempts to control the uncontrollable through superhero identity reveal the depths of his desperation. He needs to believe he has power over his curse, because accepting his complete powerlessness would mean confronting the full horror of his situation. The relationship impossibility. Kenny's curse makes normal relationship formation essentially impossible. Relationships are built on shared experiences, accumulated trust, and continuity of connection across time. Every time Kenny dies, these foundational elements are destroyed. His friends forget shared experiences, trust resets, connection discontinues. From their perspective, they wake up and Kenny is simply their friend again, with relationship baseline restored to default. They do not remember anything that happened before Kenny died. From Kenny's perspective, he has memories of everything. He remembers conversations, experiences, emotional moments. He remembers opening up to someone, trusting them, feeling connected. But they do not remember. The asymmetry creates unbearable situation for genuine relationship formation. When Kenny connects with someone, he knows that connection is temporary. The next time he dies, it will be erased from their memory. He will remember, but they will not. This makes every relationship fundamentally unstable and painful. Why invest emotional energy in connection that will be erased? Why risk vulnerability when the person will forget you were vulnerable? Why form attachment when you know you will lose it, and the other person will not even remember it existed? The theory proposes that this impossibility explains Kenny's sexual obsession and pervert behavior. Throughout the series, Kenny displays strong interest in sex, pornography, and sexuality generally. He is characterized as the pervert of the group, the one most interested in sexual content and sexual situations. If Kenny cannot form meaningful emotional connections because they will be erased, sex becomes an alternative form of connection that does not require continuity. Sexual encounters can be meaningful in the moment without requiring relationship history or future. They provide physical intimacy and temporary connection without the emotional investment that would be destroyed by his next death. Kenny's focus on sexuality can be understood as an attempt to find human connection in the only form that his curse makes psychologically sustainable. Emotional intimacy requires memory. Physical intimacy does not. He can have sexual experience with someone, and even when they forget it happened, the experience still occurred. It still provided momentary connection, momentary relief from isolation. This is not healthy relationship pattern. It is trauma response. Kenny has learned that the only connections he can have are temporary, physical, and emotionally shallow, because anything deeper will be taken from him when he dies. His friends can maintain long-term relationships because their memories persist. Kyle and Stan have years of accumulated shared experiences that form the foundation of their friendship. Kenny has those experiences in his memory, but his friends do not share them across deaths. From their perspective, their friendship with Kenny is less deep because it lacks the accumulated weight of shared history. Kenny exists on the periphery of the friend group, partly because his relationship with them is constantly resetting. They like him, they consider him their friend, but they do not have the deep bond with him that they have with each other, because that bond requires continuity of memory that the curse prevents. Kenny is fundamentally alone, even when surrounded by friends. He has relationships, but he does not have real intimacy, because intimacy requires a mutual memory and mutual investment across time. The curse has stolen his ability to experience the most important human need: genuine connection with other human beings who know him, remember him, and maintain relationship with him across time. The psychological horror of the immortal child. Immortality is often portrayed in fiction as gift or curse depending on circumstances, but generally as something that affects adults who have already lived complete childhoods and developed normal psychology. The horror of Kenny's situation is that he is an immortal child. He does not have adult coping mechanisms, adult perspective, or adult psychological resilience. He is experiencing trauma that would destroy most adults, and he is experiencing it within child psychology that has no framework for processing this level of death exposure. Children's brains are still developing. They have not yet formed the neural pathways and psychological structures that allow adults to handle severe trauma. Their capacity for emotional regulation is limited. Their understanding of death is incomplete. Their sense of time and continuity is less stable. Forcing child to experience repeated death and carry accumulated death trauma is psychological torture, far exceeding what the same experience would mean for an adult. Adults who have survived but multiple near-death experiences or who have witnessed extensive death often develop severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They experience nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, depression, and fundamental changes to their personality and worldview. This is from witnessing death or nearly dying once or a few times. Kenny has actually died hundreds of times. Each death was violent and traumatic. Each death is remembered perfectly. The theory proposes that Kenny cannot possibly be psychologically intact. No human psychology, especially not child psychology, can contain that much death exposure and remain functional. Kenny's apparent normalcy, the fact that he continues going to school, playing with friends, participating in activities, is facade. It is the surface presentation that he maintains through enormous psychological effort, while underneath, his psyche is shattered. The muffled voice, the dissociation, the inability to form real relationships, the focus on sexuality over intimacy. All of these are symptoms of someone whose psychology has been destroyed by trauma, but who continues trying to function because he has no choice. He cannot die permanently. He cannot escape. He can only continue existing, continue accumulating more trauma, continue pretending to be a normal child while carrying weight that would crush adult consciousness. The horror of the immortal child is that childhood should be time of growth, learning, and relative safety. Children should be protected from death, particularly from experiencing their own death. They should be allowed to develop psychological resilience gradually, in age-appropriate ways, with support from adults who help them process difficult experiences. Kenny has had none of this. He has been exposed to maximum trauma since birth with zero support and zero ability to escape. His entire childhood is trauma accumulation. The curse has stolen his childhood by making it impossible for him to experience normal development. Instead of learning about the world, forming friendships, discovering his interests, and growing gradually toward adulthood, Kenny is trapped in cycle of dying, being reborn, and waiting to die again. Everything else is just filler between deaths. His real life is the deaths themselves, and the impossible burden of remembering all of them while everyone around him forgets. No child should carry this. No adult should carry this. But Kenny has no choice. The curse continues whether he can bear it or not. Why this theory makes sense. The cursed immortal theory is not speculation or fan interpretation. The show explicitly confirmed that Kenny's deaths are real, that his resurrections are caused by supernatural curse, and that he remembers every death while others forget. The Mysterian episodes made this canonical. What the theory adds is analysis of the psychological implications. If Kenny's situation is real within the show's universe, then certain psychological consequences must follow. Someone experiencing what Kenny experiences would develop the trauma responses, dissociation, relationship difficulties, and coping mechanisms that Kenny displays. The theory simply extends the show's explicit content to its logical conclusions. Kenny's behavior throughout the series makes sense when understood as trauma response. His muffled voice is dissociation made physical. His relationship patterns reflect someone who cannot afford emotional intimacy. His Mysterian identity is an attempt to gain control over a helpless situation. Every aspect of his character can be understood through a lens of accumulated death trauma and complete isolation in that experience. The curse also explains why Kenny has not developed or changed across the series' run. Character growth requires learning from experiences and carrying those lessons forward. Kenny's experiences are reset, partially with each death. More importantly, the trauma he carries is so overwhelming that normal development becomes impossible. He is not growing because he is using all his psychological energy simply to survive the curse. There is nothing left for normal childhood development. Recontextualizing Kenny's deaths from comedy to horror changes how viewers understand his character and his role in the show. He is not comic relief character who dies for laughs. He is the most tragic character in South Park, suffering more than any other character, carrying burden that exceeds human capacity, completely alone in knowledge of his own suffering. Every death viewers laughed at was real death that Kenny experienced and remembered. Every casual resurrection was another rebirth into continued curse. The comedy disguises one of the darkest character situations in animated television. A child trapped in an eternal cycle of traumatic death with no escape, no support, and no one who even remembers his suffering. Kenny McCormick is the most tragic character in South Park, though most people watching do not recognize this because they experience what everyone in-universe experiences, forgetting he died. His deaths are real, his resurrections are real, his memories of dying are real, and his complete isolation in those memories is real. He is child-carrying trauma that would destroy adults, unable to speak clearly because dissociation is the only defense his shattered psyche can maintain, unable to form real relationships because they will be erased with his next death, unable to escape the cycle no matter what he does. His curse is not death itself. Death would be mercy, final escape from the cycle. His curse is living forever, dying repeatedly, and being completely alone in that knowledge. The muffled voice, the hood covering his face, the inability to truly connect with others. These are not character quirks. They are symptoms of destroyed psyche trying desperately to survive one more resurrection, one more death, one more cycle in eternal punishment that will never end because the curse cannot be broken and Kenny cannot die permanently. He will die again tomorrow. And the day after. And the day after that. Forever. And no one will remember except him. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Butters Stotch, the repressed psychopath theory. Butters Stotch, the repressed psychopath. Theory: Butters Stotch appears to be the most innocent, naive, and genuinely sweet child in South Park. While his classmates have become cynical, jaded, or outright cruel, Butters maintains an almost painful innocence. He trusts people who manipulate him. He follows rules even when rules make no sense. He wants desperately to please authority figures and be a good boy. His politeness, his earnestness, and his childlike wonder seem refreshingly pure in a show filled with corruption and moral degradation. But this innocence sits uncomfortably alongside certain other aspects of Butters' character. When he adopts his Professor Chaos alter ego, he reveals capacity for destructive impulses and grandiose fantasies of causing harm. When supervision is removed, his behavior changes dramatically in ways that suggest capabilities he normally keeps hidden. His occasional violent outbursts are disproportionate and disturbing. The theory proposes that Butters is not actually innocent at all. His extreme naivety and compliance are masks created by years of severe abuse from his parents. Beneath this carefully constructed facade of goodness is repressed psychopathic nature that his father's constant punishment has forced underground. Butters has learned to hide his true self to survive, but the true self has not been eliminated. It has been compressed, contained, and forced into hiding. Professor Chaos is not imagination or roleplay. It is the real Butters finally breaking through the repression, and his parents' abuse has not prevented him from becoming dangerous. It has created a psychological pressure cooker that will eventually explode with catastrophic results. The abuse that shaped the monster. Stephen Stotch subjects his son to physical, emotional, and psychological abuse, with frequency and severity that makes him one of the most extensively abused children in animated television. Butters is grounded constantly for infractions that are minor, imaginary, or completely outside his control. He is blamed for problems he did not cause. He is punished for situations where he was the victim. Stephen hits Butters, humiliates him publicly, and psychologically terrorizes him with threats and manipulation. The mother, Linda Stotch, is complicit in this abuse, enabling Stephen's behavior, and occasionally participating herself. The grounding serves as convenient punishment for almost anything. Butters breathes wrong, speaks at inappropriate moment, fails to predict his parents' unstated expectations. Grounded. Someone else does something bad and Butters happens to be present. Grounded. Butters succeeds at something and his father feels threatened. Grounded. The punishments bear no logical relationship to any actual misbehavior because they are not really about discipline. They are about control and the expression of Stephen's own psychological issues through dominance of his helpless child. The physical abuse appears in multiple episodes. Stephen has been shown hitting Butters, threatening him with violence, and creating fear through physical intimidation. The show plays some of this for dark comedy, but the cumulative picture is of child living in genuine fear of physical harm from his father. The psychological abuse may be even more damaging. Stephen gaslights Butters constantly, making him question his own perceptions and memories. Stephen blames Butters for things that are demonstrably not his fault, forcing Butters to accept responsibility for problems he did not create. Stephen uses love and approval as weapons, withdrawing them to punish and offering them conditionally to control. This creates in Butters a desperate need to please, a hypervigilance about his father's moods, and a warped understanding of cause and effect, where he believes he is responsible for his father's emotional states and behavioral choices. One of the most disturbing episodes involves Stephen attempting to kill Butters. After believing his wife was having an affair, and incorrectly concluding that Butters knew about it, Stephen decides to kill his son. He takes Butters to a secluded location intending to murder him. The plan fails only through accident and Butters' resilience. This is not strict parenting or old-fashioned discipline. This is attempted murder of a child by his father. The fact that Stephen believed killing his son was appropriate response to family conflict reveals the depths of his psychological disturbance and the danger Butters lives with constantly. According to the theory, this extensive, sustained abuse would have predictable psychological effects on any child. Typically, severe childhood abuse produces one of several outcomes. Some children internalize the abuse and become depressed, anxious, and self-destructive. Some children externalize it and become aggressive, oppositional, and antisocial. Some children dissociate and develop fragmented personalities as protection. Butters appears to have taken a different path. He has created elaborate performance of perfect obedience and innocence while burying his real nature so deeply that even he may not fully recognize it. The abuse taught Butters that expressing his true thoughts, feelings, or desires results in punishment. The only safe response is to become exactly what his father demands: a polite, obedient, harmless boy who never causes problems, never questions authority, never asserts himself. Butters learned this lesson so thoroughly that the performance became his dominant personality. But performances are not authentic selves. Beneath the performance, the real Butters still exists, watching, waiting, accumulating rage and destructive impulses that have nowhere to go except deeper underground. Professor Chaos. The true self emerges. When Butters creates his Professor Chaos villain identity, the show presents it as make-believe, a child playing at being bad guy because he is tired of being excluded and underestimated. He designs a costume, adopts a dramatic persona, and plots various schemes to cause chaos in South Park. The schemes are typically ineffective and harmless, played for comedy as Butters fails to cause any real damage. But examination of what Butters is actually doing as Professor Chaos reveals something more disturbing than innocent roleplay. As Professor Chaos, Butters plots destruction and harm to others. He fantasizes about causing suffering, disrupting society, and asserting dominance through a malevolent action. His stated goals are not pranks or mischief. They are genuine attempts to hurt people and damage the community. The fact that he fails to execute these plans effectively does not change the nature of what he is attempting. When Butters is Professor Chaos, he feels no remorse about planning harm. He expresses no concern for potential victims. He revels in his villainous identity, taking pleasure in the idea of causing chaos. This is not normal play behavior where children pretend to be villains, but maintain understanding that hurting people is wrong. This is Butters accessing genuine desire to cause harm and expressing it through the safe container of alter ego. The theory proposes that Professor Chaos is not alter ego or imagination. It is Butters' authentic personality breaking through the repression that his abuse has forced on him. When he is Professor Chaos, Butters is finally being himself, expressing the thoughts and desires that he must hide when he is performing as good Butters. The villain identity gives him permission to be who he really is without facing consequences because everyone, including Butters himself, treats it as make-believe. But the desires are real. The pleasure he takes in planning destruction is real. The absence of empathy for potential victims is real. Professor Chaos is the truth beneath the performance, the psychopathic nature that has been forced underground by years of abuse, finally finding outlet in form that seems safe, because it is framed as play. The contrast between good Butters and Professor Chaos is too extreme to be simple imagination. Children who play at being villains do not typically display the level of commitment, planning, and genuine antisocial desire that Butters shows as Professor Chaos. They play at being bad while maintaining their actual moral center. Butters does not seem to have moral center when he is Professor Chaos. He has only the desires he normally must repress. The villain identity is not corruption of innocence. It is revelation of what was always there beneath the innocent facade. Stephen Stotch has not created goodness through his abuse. He has created pressure cooker where Butters' true nature is compressed and contained through constant threat of punishment. Professor Chaos represents the steam escaping, the pressure finding release in form that does not immediately trigger consequences. As long as Butters frames his destructive impulses as make-believe villainy, he can express them without his father recognizing the danger. But the impulses themselves are authentic, and they are accumulating power the longer they remain repressed. Butters. Without supervision. The most revealing evidence for Butters' hidden nature comes from observing what happens when his parents' supervision is removed. In multiple episodes, when Butters finds himself in situations where his father is not watching and cannot immediately punish him, his behavior changes dramatically. He does not simply relax or become more playful. He transforms into someone almost unrecognizable, displaying capabilities and moral flexibility that should not be possible for someone as innocent as he appears. The most striking example occurs in Butters' Bottom Bitch, where Butters accidentally enters the prostitution business and rapidly becomes successful pimp. This is not a situation where Butters is corrupted slowly or manipulated by others. He recognizes opportunity, understands immediately how prostitution works as business model, and executes sophisticated operation with business acumen that would impress adult entrepreneurs. He recruits women, he manages them, he handles customers, he deals with police, he understands the psychology of exploitation and applies it effectively. This happens within single episode, suggesting these capabilities were already present and simply needed opportunity to emerge. The speed and competence of Butters' transition to pimp is psychologically impossible if he is actually the innocent child he appears to be. Genuinely innocent children do not recognize prostitution as business opportunity. They do not immediately understand the mechanics of exploitation. They do not naturally adopt manipulative tactics for controlling their workers. These capabilities require understanding of human psychology, willingness to exploit others, an absence of moral qualms about profiting from others' degradation. Butters displays all of these. He does not struggle with moral questions about what he is doing. He does not express concern for the women he is exploiting. He approaches the situation as pure business opportunity and executes it with efficiency that suggests this is his natural mode of operating when freed from constraints. The theory proposes that Butters' innocent persona is performance he maintains only when under supervision. When supervision is removed, the real Butters emerges, someone who understands exploitation, manipulation, and control instinctively, who has no natural empathy preventing him from using others, who views people as resources to be managed rather than as individuals whose well-being matters. This is not learned behavior. Butters does not study how to be pimp or receive instruction. He simply understands it naturally, suggesting these capabilities and this worldview were already part of his psychological makeup. Other episodes where supervision is reduced show similar patterns. Butters in positions of authority tends toward tyranny rather than benevolence. Butters given freedom tends toward behavior that violates norms rather than careful exploration within acceptable boundaries. Butters without immediate threat of punishment does not simply become a more relaxed version of good Butters. He becomes a fundamentally different person whose capabilities and moral framework bear no resemblance to the innocent child his parents believe they are raising. The consistency of this pattern, Butters' changes when unwatched, suggests that the performance requires active maintenance. When he must perform innocence to avoid punishment, he performs it. When that pressure is removed, the performance drops and real Butters appears. The ease with which he transitions between these modes indicates that this is not occasional lapse or moral confusion. This is someone who has two versions of himself, the fake one for public consumption and the real one that emerges when he believes it is safe. The pimp who understood exploitation. The details of Butters' prostitution operation deserve closer examination because they reveal psychological sophistication that should be impossible for genuinely innocent child. Running prostitution ring requires understanding multiple complex systems simultaneously. Butters had to understand the basic economics, how to price services, how to manage cash flow, how to handle the split between his earnings and the workers' earnings. He had to understand marketing, how to attract customers without drawing unwanted attention. He had to understand management, how to recruit workers, how to keep them motivated or controlled, how to handle conflicts and problems. He had to understand psychology. What motivates the women to stay in the operation? What vulnerabilities can be exploited? What fears or desires can be manipulated? Most significantly, he had to understand law enforcement, how to avoid police attention, how to handle interactions with police when they occur, what stories and explanations will be accepted. Butters demonstrated competence in all of these areas simultaneously. This is not beginner's luck or cartoon convenience. This is systematic application of understanding that must have been present before the opportunity arose. The most disturbing aspect is Butters' complete lack of empathy for the women he is exploiting. He does not see them as people in difficult circumstances who deserve compassion. He sees them as assets generating income. When they have problems, his concern is only about how those problems affect the business operation. When they want to leave, his response is to find ways to keep them working. He displays no guilt, no moral struggle, no sense that what he is doing might be wrong. This absence of conscience is diagnostic. Normal children, even ones in difficult moral situations, experience some level of internal conflict. They feel bad about hurting others even when they choose to do it anyway. Butters shows no evidence of this internal moral voice. He operates as pure pragmatist, focused only on business success. This suggests his psychology lacks the empathy and conscience that create moral restraint in normal human beings. The ease with which he adopts pimp identity is particularly revealing. He does not struggle with the role. He does not need time to adjust to exploitation and manipulation as his primary modes. He inhabits the role naturally from the moment he recognizes what the situation is. This natural fit indicates these capabilities were not newly developed, but pre-existing, waiting for appropriate context to manifest. When the prostitution operation is eventually discovered and shut down, Butters returns to his innocent persona without apparent difficulty. He does not seem marked by the experience. He does not show signs of trauma or moral growth. He simply reverts to performing good Butters, as though the pimp episode never happened. This ability to switch between modes without transition period or psychological difficulty suggests dissociation, or the presence of fundamentally separate operational frameworks. Butters can be innocent. Butters when supervision requires it, and can be exploitative. Butters when opportunity allows. And he can move between these modes seamlessly, because neither is authentic struggle for him. Both are roles he can inhabit as circumstances require. The violence beneath the surface. Butters' relationship with violence follows a troubling pattern. Most of the time, he is completely non-violent, conflict avoidant, and physically harmless. He does not fight back when bullied. He does not stand up for himself physically. He appears to have no aggressive capability whatsoever. But occasionally, Butters snaps into extreme violence with no gradual escalation or warning. In the episode Butterballs, Butters is bullied by a particularly cruel grandmother. He endures this bullying for an extended period, absorbing abuse without response. Then he suddenly attacks her with shocking violence, beating her brutally. The violence is not defensive or proportionate. It is explosive release of accumulated rage. In other episodes, when Butters finally responds to provocation, his response is disproportionate. He does not push back gently or assert boundaries. He erupts in violence that seems to come from nowhere and targets the victim with precision and force. That should not be possible for someone with no fighting experience or aggressive training. The pattern is telling. Long periods of perfect submission followed by sudden eruptions of extreme violence. This is not normal response pattern even for abused children. This suggests violence is always present beneath the surface, always available, but normally kept under rigid control. When that control breaks, the violence emerges fully formed and effective. The precision of Butters' violence is particularly notable. When he fights, he does not flail or lose control in the way children typically do when they finally snap. He targets specific areas. His movements are effective. He causes maximum harm with his attacks. This suggests the violence is not wild emotional response, but calculated attack that has been imagined or planned many times before being executed. Butters may have been fantasizing about violence, thinking through how he would hurt his tormentors, planning the attacks in his mind while maintaining his harmless exterior. When he finally acts on these fantasies, the planning shows in the execution. The theory proposes that Butters' violence represents his authentic response to how he experiences the world. He is surrounded by people who hurt, control, and exploit him. His natural response would be to hurt them back. But his father's abuse has taught him that expressing aggression results in severe punishment. He must keep the violence hidden. It accumulates pressure with each new humiliation, each new abuse. Each moment he must swallow rage and present sweet compliance instead. Most of the time, his control holds. But occasionally, the pressure exceeds his capacity to contain it. The violence explodes out in disproportionate eruption precisely because it has been compressed for so long. Each violent episode releases some pressure temporarily, but the underlying rage continues to accumulate because the sources of his abuse and humiliation continue unchanged. Why naivety is survival mechanism. Butter's extreme naivety, his tendency to believe obvious lies, his inability to recognize manipulation, his trust in people who repeatedly betray him, appears at first to be genuine innocence. But examination of the context where Butters displays naivety reveals strategic pattern. His naivety primarily manifests in situations where recognizing manipulation or betrayal would require him to confront someone in authority or stand up for himself. According to the theory, Butters' naivety is not cognitive limitation or genuine innocence. It is carefully maintained survival mechanism. Abused children learn quickly which behaviors keep them safe and which behaviors trigger punishment. Standing up to authority, questioning adult decisions, recognizing when they are being mistreated, and objecting to it. These behaviors are dangerous in abusive households. They result in punishment. The child learns that the safer path is to pretend not to notice, to accept whatever explanation is offered, to remain obedient and trusting, even when trust is obviously misplaced. Butters has perfected this survival strategy. When Cartman manipulates him, Butters appears to believe Cartman's obvious lies. This keeps him from having to confront Cartman, which might result in conflict that Butters has learned to avoid. When his father punishes him unjustly, Butters accepts the punishment without arguing that he did nothing wrong. This prevents escalation that would lead to worse punishment. His naivety is performance that protects him from consequences of recognizing and responding to how he is actually being treated. If he admitted to himself that people are constantly manipulating and exploiting him, he would face pressure to do something about it. But doing something about it would be dangerous. Better to perform naivety, to pretend he does not understand what is happening, to maintain plausible deniability about his own exploitation. The theory proposes that Butters is actually quite intelligent and fully aware of how others manipulate him. The pimp episode demonstrates his capability for understanding complex social dynamics and power relationships. That understanding does not disappear when he returns to his normal life. It is still there, still operating, still analyzing what others are doing to him. But he cannot act on that understanding without facing consequences that his abuse has taught him to avoid at all costs. So he pretends not to understand. He performs innocence so convincingly that even he might sometimes believe it. This is protective dissociation, disconnecting from knowledge that is too dangerous to acknowledge. The maintenance of this performance requires constant effort. Butters must actively suppress his understanding, must choose to appear naive rather than demonstrating his actual comprehension. This is why his naivety sometimes slips, why occasionally he reveals that he understands more than he lets on. The performance is difficult to maintain perfectly all the time, especially when his actual understanding would be so useful to him. But most of the time, he maintains it successfully, because the alternative, being recognized as intelligent, aware child who understands when he is being exploited, would require him to either defend himself or admit he is choosing not to defend himself. Both options are psychologically unacceptable, given his history of abuse. Performing naivety is his solution to impossible situation. It allows him to survive without having to confront how terrible his life actually is. Stephen Stotch. Creating a powder keg. Stephen Stotch believes he is preventing bad behavior through strict discipline and harsh punishment. He sees Butters' compliance as evidence that his parenting is effective. When Butters obeys, Stephen interprets this as successful behavioral control. When Butters is polite and harmless, Stephen believes he has created good child through consistent enforcement of standards. But Stephen fundamentally misunderstands what he is actually creating. Harsh punishment does not eliminate bad behavior. It teaches children to hide bad behavior while learning to avoid punishment. When children are severely punished for expressing anger, they do not stop feeling anger. They learn to hide the anger while it accumulates internally. When children are punished for asserting themselves, they do not stop having needs and desires. They learn to suppress those needs while resentment grows beneath the surface. Stephen is not preventing Butters from having aggressive, selfish, or destructive impulses. He is teaching Butters to compress those impulses so thoroughly that when they finally escape containment, the result will be explosive. Every punishment Stephen delivers adds to the pressure. Each grounding is another increment of rage that Butters must absorb. Each humiliation is another wound that will eventually demand expression. Each unfair consequence is another reason for Butters to hate his father and the world that allows such treatment. The theory uses the metaphor of powder keg, explosive device where pressure builds until container can no longer contain it, resulting in violent explosion. Stephen has made Butters into a human version of this device. The pressure builds with each abuse, each punishment, each moment. Butters must swallow his true response and present false compliance. The container. Butters' psychological controls that keep his real nature hidden can only withstand finite amount of pressure. Each new increment brings him closer to the point where the container fails and everything he has been repressing erupts at once. The danger is that Stephen does not recognize what he is creating. He sees compliant child and assumes he has successfully shaped behavior. He does not see the accumulating pressure beneath the compliance. He does not understand that his punishment is not eliminating problems, but concentrating them into more dangerous form. When Butters eventually breaks, and the theory proposes this is inevitable, Stephen will be shocked because he believed his methods were working. He will not understand that his methods were precisely what guaranteed catastrophic failure. The longer the pressure builds, the worse the eventual explosion will be. If Butters had exploded as a young child, the damage would have been limited by his physical capabilities and limited understanding. But Stephen is maintaining the pressure through Butters' development into adolescence, and will presumably continue into adulthood. By the time Butters breaks, he will have accumulated years or decades of repressed rage, refined capabilities for planning and execution, and comprehensive understanding of how to cause maximum harm. Stephen is creating time bombs set to explode at the moment when Butters has maximum capacity to act on his worst impulses and minimum reason to restrain himself. The inevitable break. All evidence points toward Butters' eventual psychological break as not merely possible, but inevitable. The accumulating pressure of repressed rage, the increasingly sophisticated capabilities he demonstrates when supervision is removed, the violent outbursts that reveal his underlying nature, the complete lack of genuine moral development beneath his compliant performance, all of these factors combine to create a situation that cannot persist indefinitely. Something must give. Either Butters' control will break, or his psychology will fracture in ways that produce different but equally dangerous outcomes. Professor Chaos represents warning sign. What appears as make-believe villainy is Butters' true nature pushing against the constraints. Each appearance of Professor Chaos is the pressure finding small release, preventing total catastrophic failure temporarily. But these small releases are insufficient to prevent eventual larger break, because the sources of pressure, his father's abuse, his lack of agency, his need to hide his true nature, continue unabated. The pimp episode represents another warning sign. When given opportunity and freedom from supervision, Butters immediately becomes someone capable of systematic exploitation and manipulation. This capability does not develop overnight. It must have been present all along, waiting for context where it could emerge. The fact that he can inhabit this role so naturally suggests it fits his authentic psychology better than the innocent role he normally performs. The violence represents the most direct warning sign. Butters has already demonstrated that his control can break, that when it does, the result is extreme disproportionate violence, and that he is capable of causing serious harm once his constraints fail. These eruptions are becoming more frequent or more severe, suggesting the pressure is building toward a critical point. The theory proposes that Butters will eventually experience complete break, where his repressed nature emerges permanently rather than in temporary episodes. When this happens, South Park will discover that the most innocent-seeming child was actually the most dangerous one all along. The break could take multiple forms. Butters might attack his father in violent culmination of accumulated rage at years of abuse. He might turn his capabilities towards systematic harm of everyone who has exploited or humiliated him. He might simply abandon the innocent performance entirely and begin operating openly as someone who understands exploitation and has no moral restraints, preventing him from using that understanding. Whatever form the break takes, the outcome will be shocking to everyone who believed Butters was harmless and innocent. His parents will be confronted with what their abuse created. His classmates will discover that the naive child they manipulated was far more aware and dangerous than they recognized. The community will face the reality that they ignored warning signs because Butters' compliance made him easy to dismiss as non-threat. The tragedy, if tragedy applies to psychopath creation, is that this outcome was preventable. If Butters had received appropriate intervention, if his abuse had been recognized and stopped, if he had been given genuine support, rather than continued punishment, his development might have taken a different path. But those interventions did not occur. Stephen's abuse continued. Butters learned to hide rather than to heal. The pressure accumulated. And now the break is not a question of if, but of when and how severe. Butters' Stotch is psychological time bomb walking through South Park Elementary. His sweet naivety is elaborate performance developed to survive years of severe abuse. Beneath that performance is something calculating, capable of sophisticated exploitation, comfortable with violence, and completely lacking the empathy and conscience that would prevent him from causing extraordinary harm. Professor Chaos is not imagination. The pimp is not corruption. The violence is not aberration. These are all glimpses of real Butters, the one his parents' abuse has forced into hiding. Every grounding, every beating, every humiliation adds pressure to a psychological system that was already strained beyond normal human tolerance. His parents believe they are preventing him from becoming bad. They are creating exactly what they fear. When Butters finally stops repressing his true nature, when the performance becomes unsustainable, South Park will learn that the child who seemed most innocent was always the most dangerous. The explosion is coming. Everyone will act surprised. But the warning signs were always there for anyone willing to see them. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Randy Marsh, the Arrested Development Theory, Mr. Garrison, the Fragmented Identity Theory. Mr. Garrison has undergone more identity transformations than any character in television history. He began the series as closeted gay man living in denial about his sexuality, then became openly gay man, then transitioned to become woman named Mrs. Garrison, then identified as lesbian woman, then transitioned back to become man again, and eventually became version of himself that bore resemblance to Donald Trump during his presidency. Each transformation appears to completely erase the previous identity. Mrs. Garrison does not seem to remember or acknowledge being Mr. Garrison in ways that suggest continuity of consciousness. President Garrison acts as though previous identities belong to someone else entirely. The shifts are not gradual evolution of self-understanding, but abrupt replacements where one complete personality disappears and another takes its place. The show has played these transformations primarily for social and political satire, using Garrison's shifts to comment on gender politics, identity issues, and contemporary events. But there exists psychological explanation that accounts for the extreme nature of these changes and the apparent discontinuity between identities. Mr. Garrison does not have a stable sense of self that is evolving or exploring different expressions. He has dissociative identity disorder, previously known as multiple personality disorder, caused by severe childhood trauma. Each version of Garrison that has appeared throughout the series is separate alter, a distinct identity created to protect the core self from unbearable psychological pain. The gay teacher, the trans woman, the lesbian, the president, none of these is the real Garrison. They are protective identities that emerge when previous alters could no longer cope with the trauma and stress of existence. The original Garrison, the child who was abused so severely that his psyche shattered into fragments, is buried so deep that he may never surface again. The abuse that fractured everything. The show has provided explicit information about Garrison's childhood trauma in the episode The Entity, though the revelation is presented in characteristically disturbing South Park fashion. Garrison becomes upset when developing relationship with his father, and eventually admits that his numerous psychological problems stem from the fact that his father never molested him. On surface, this seems absurd, being upset about not being abused. But the statement reveals something darker. Garrison's distress about his father not being his abuser indicates that someone else was. His fixation on his father's lack of abuse represents a desperate attempt to create narrative that makes sense of his trauma. If his father had been the abuser, Garrison would at least have clear understanding of what happened to him and why he is psychologically damaged. The reality that his father was not the perpetrator means Garrison must confront more confusing truth. Someone else abused him severely, and his father either did not know or did not protect him. This creates layered trauma, where the abuse itself is compounded by feelings of abandonment and lack of protection from the parent who should have kept him safe. The fact that Garrison wanted to believe his father molested him suggests the actual abuse was so severe and the actual perpetrator so threatening that Garrison's mind has created alternative narrative as protection. This is common in trauma survivors, creating false memories or alternative explanations that feel psychologically safer than confronting the true horror of what occurred. Dissociative identity disorder develops specifically as response to severe childhood trauma, typically sustained abuse occurring before age 9 when personality is still forming. The child's psyche cannot integrate the traumatic experiences with the normal development, so it splits. Different identities emerge to handle different aspects of experience. One identity holds the trauma memories, another handles daily functioning, another contains the rage, another maintains social relationships. This fragmentation protects the core self by compartmentalizing unbearable experiences. According to the theory, Garrison suffered catastrophic childhood sexual abuse, likely sustained over a period of years, that was so severe his developing personality fragmented into multiple distinct identities as survival mechanism. The Garrison viewers see is not single person who has lived continuous life. He is collection of alters, each created at different time to handle different psychological needs, taking turns controlling the body and living the life, while original Garrison remains hidden and inaccessible. The abuse was not single incident, but sustained campaign of violation that taught young Garrison that his body was not safe, that adults could not be trusted, that the world was a dangerous place where terrible things happened without reason or escape. This sustained trauma during critical developmental period created the conditions necessary for DID to develop. Garrison's psyche split as his only available defense mechanism, creating separate identities that could each handle small portion of the overwhelming horror that single integrated personality could not survive experiencing. Dissociative identity disorder. Diagnosis. Dissociative identity disorder is one of the most severe and controversial diagnoses in psychiatric literature, characterized by presence of two or more distinct personality states or identities that recurrently take control of individuals' behavior. Each alter has its own pattern of perceiving, relating to, and thinking about self and environment. The disorder includes inability to recall important personal information that is too extensive to be explained by ordinary forgetfulness. DID develops exclusively as response to severe trauma, typically sustained childhood abuse. The diagnosis requires that symptoms cause significant distress or impairment in functioning and cannot be better explained by cultural or religious practices, substance use, or other medical conditions. Garrison meets every diagnostic criterion with precision that suggests either the show's creators understand the condition's clinical presentation or Garrison's character accidentally became textbook example of the disorder. The presence of distinct identities is undeniable. Gay Mr. Garrison, Mrs. Garrison, Lesbian Garrison, and President Garrison are not the same person expressing themselves differently. They have different mannerisms, different speech patterns, different core beliefs, different relationships to their own body and identity. When Mrs. Garrison is present, she does not think of herself as a man who transitioned. She loathes herself as woman, complete with different memories and different understanding of her own history. When President Garrison emerges, he appears to have limited access to memories from previous alters, operating as though he is someone new rather than continuation of previous identities. The memory gaps between alters provide strong evidence for DID rather than simple identity exploration. Each Garrison alter seems to have incomplete or altered memories of what previous alters experienced. Mrs. Garrison's memories of being Mr. Garrison are fuzzy or reinterpreted through her current identity, rather than clearly remembered as continuous experience. President Garrison acts as though previous identities are distant or unimportant, rather than recent lived experiences. This is hallmark of DID. Alters do not share complete memory access. Each alter has its own memory system that may or may not overlap with others. The host alter, the one most frequently in control, may have no memory of what other alters do when they are in control. This creates time loss and confusion for the individual, though some alters may be aware of each other while others remain completely separate. The distress and impairment criteria are evident in Garrison's chaotic life. His relationships fail repeatedly. His professional life is unstable. His sense of self is so fragmented that he cannot maintain consistent identity across time. He makes decisions as one alter that other alters do not understand or agree with, creating internal conflict and external chaos. His functioning is significantly impaired by his inability to maintain integrated sense of self. The disorder also explains Garrison's relationship with Mr. Hat, the hand puppet he used extensively in early seasons, and with Mr. Slave, his BDSM partner. Before Garrison's identities were distinct enough to switch between, he externalized internal alters as separate beings. Mr. Hat represented another part of Garrison's personality, speaking thoughts and opinions that Garrison could not consciously acknowledge as his own. Mr. Hat said what Garrison thought but could not say, behaving in ways Garrison wanted to behave but felt he could not. This externalization is a preliminary form of dissociation, where instead of separate identities taking control, the fragmented parts are projected onto external objects or people. The alters: Gay Garrison, Mrs. Garrison, President Garrison. The theory identifies the major Garrison identities viewers have witnessed as distinct alters created at different times in response to different psychological needs and stressors. The original Mr. Garrison, the closeted gay man who taught elementary school with crippling self-hatred and internalized homophobia, was likely not the core personality, but already an alter created to handle adult life after childhood trauma. This alter was characterized by extreme anxiety, sexual confusion, aggressive denial of his own sexuality, and inappropriate behavior with students that suggested someone barely maintaining control over a chaotic internal state. His relationship with Mr. Hat represented this alter's awareness of other parts of the system that he could not fully integrate or acknowledge. When this alter finally accepted his homosexuality and came out, it created temporary relief. But coming out did not resolve the underlying trauma or the fragmentation it created. The openly gay Mr. Garrison alter functioned somewhat better than the closeted version, but still exhibited instability, poor boundaries, and inability to maintain healthy relationships. This alter eventually became unable to cope with accumulated stress and life circumstances, creating conditions for new alter to emerge. Mrs. Garrison appeared not through gradual transition process, but through abrupt replacement. One episode, Mr. Garrison was gay man. Next episode, she was woman with completely different personality, different mannerisms, and different understanding of her own history. This is not how gender transition typically occurs. Transition is usually a process of external changes, bringing body into alignment with internal sense of gender identity that has been consistent. Mrs. Garrison's transition looked more like personality replacement, where entirely new identity took control of the body. Mrs. Garrison's personality differed dramatically from Mr. Garrison's. She was more sexually aggressive, more confident, more volatile. She had different teaching style, different relationships with other characters, different core beliefs about herself and the world. If this were the same person transitioning, some core personality elements should have remained consistent. Instead, nearly everything changed, suggesting different alter had assumed control. The lesbian Garrison identity represented another shift, where Mrs. Garrison's attraction to men changed to attraction to women, again with personality alterations that suggested different alter rather than same person's evolving preferences. President Garrison, the most extreme transformation, bears almost no resemblance to any previous identity. His aggressive, narcissistic, authoritarian personality contrasts sharply with earlier alters. His apparent lack of memory about or concern for previous identities, his completely different worldview and behavior patterns, all indicate separate alter, who has minimal connection to previous fragments of Garrison's fractured psyche. Mr. Hat and Mr. Slave, externalized alters. Before Garrison's alters became distinct enough to fully take control through identity switches, his dissociation manifested through externalization. Mr. Hat, the hand puppet that Garrison carried, constantly and conversed with as though it were a separate being, represented Garrison's awareness of internal fragmentation that he could not yet acknowledge as parts of himself. Garrison did not simply use puppet for teaching. He had genuine conversations with Mr. Hat where the puppet expressed opinions and made statements that Garrison would then respond to or argue with. Mr. Hat functioned as external voice for thoughts and feelings that Garrison could not consciously claim as his own. When Mr. Hat said something inappropriate or aggressive, Garrison could distance himself from the statement while still having expressed it. This is preliminary dissociation, using external object to express internal alter's perspective without having to acknowledge that the alter exists within the self. The conversations between Garrison and Mr. Hat represented internal dialogue between different parts of fractured personality, externalized into form that felt safer than recognizing the fragmentation within his own mind. Mr. Hat had distinct personality, more aggressive, more honest, more willing to express socially unacceptable thoughts. This personality was not creation of Garrison's conscious imagination, but manifestation of actual alter, whose thoughts and feelings were being channeled through the puppet because full identity switching had not yet developed or was too frightening to allow. Mr. Slave, Garrison's BDSM partner, served similar function of externalizing internal fragmentation. Mr. Slave was not simply romantic partner, but representation of another aspect of Garrison's fractured self, the part that had experienced sexual trauma and had processed that trauma through submission and sexual extremity. The relationship between Garrison and Mr. Slave was not typical romantic relationship, but rather externalized relationship between trauma, holder alter, and functioning alter within DID system. Mr. Slave's extreme submission represented the alter that held memories of abuse and had adapted to that abuse through sexualizing submission. Garrison's relationship with him allowed expression of these trauma-based dynamics while maintaining them as external relationship rather than recognizing them as internal fragmentation. The theory proposes that Mr. Hat and Mr. Slave were a transitional phase in Garrison's DID development. As his disorder progressed and stress increased, the externalized parts eventually needed to become internal alters who could fully control behavior and consciousness. Mr. Hat disappeared from the show as Garrison's identity switching became more pronounced. The puppet was no longer necessary because the alters it represented were now switching directly rather than speaking through intermediary object. Mr. Slave separated from Garrison as the dynamics they represented became internalized within Garrison's system rather than played out through external relationship. The memory gaps. One of the most diagnostically significant aspects of Garrison's presentation is the apparent discontinuity of memory across his identity changes. Each alter appears to have incomplete or altered access to memories created by previous alters. When Mrs. Garrison refers to her past as Mr. Garrison, she does not describe it with the clarity and ownership that would characterize someone remembering their own continuous life. Instead, she describes it with distance, as though talking about someone else or accessing memories that feel disconnected from her current self. She knows intellectually that she used to be Mr. Garrison, but she does not seem to have full emotional connection to those memories or complete access to the experiences. President Garrison demonstrates even more extreme memory discontinuity. He operates as though previous identities are irrelevant or barely remembered. His behaviors and choices show no apparent influence from lessons learned or relationships formed by previous alters. He starts essentially fresh, with only minimal acknowledgement that other identities preceded him. This is consistent with how DID memory systems function. Different alters have different memory access. Some alters may be completely amnesic for what other alters experience. They have time loss, wake up in situations with no memory of how they got there, find evidence of activities they do not remember doing. Other alters may have partial access to other alters' memories, but experience those memories as distant or dreamlike, rather than as their own lived experiences. Still, other alters may have relatively complete access to the system's memories while remaining distinct personalities. The memory gaps explain why Garrison's character development does not accumulate across his transformations. Normal character development would show learning and growth, with past experiences influencing current behavior and choices. Garrison shows minimal evidence of this pattern. Each alter largely starts over, making similar mistakes, failing to apply lessons from previous experiences, operating as though past does not constrain or inform present. If Garrison were single continuous consciousness exploring different identity expressions, his core personality and accumulated wisdom would remain consistent even as external presentation changed. Instead, each alter appears to be working with limited information about what came before, making decisions based on incomplete understanding of the life's history, repeating patterns because the alter currently in control does not have full access to memories of how those patterns failed previously. This creates Garrison's characteristic chaos. Life that should become more stable with experience instead becomes more chaotic because no single alter is accumulating the full experience. Each alter is learning independently with incomplete information, preventing genuine growth or stability. Why each identity is violently different. The extreme differences between Garrison's alters exceed what would be expected from normal identity exploration or even from gender transition. Gay Mr. Garrison and Mrs. Garrison did not just differ in gender presentation, they had fundamentally different personalities, values, behaviors, and worldviews. Mrs. Garrison was sexually aggressive where Mr. Garrison had been anxious. President Garrison is authoritarian and narcissistic, where earlier identities were insecure and approval-seeking. These are not variations on theme, but completely distinct personality structures. In DID, alters develop different personalities because they serve different psychological functions and emerge in response to different needs or stressors. One alter might hold the trauma memories and experience chronic fear and hypervigilance. Another alter might be the caretaker who manages daily responsibilities and maintains appearance of normal functioning. Another might be the protector who emerges during threatening situations and responds with aggression to defend the system. Another might be the child alter who holds the original personality as it existed before trauma fragmented it. Each alter's personality is shaped by its function within the system and by the circumstances under which it developed. According to the theory, Garrison's alters each emerged in response to specific psychological crises that previous alters could no longer handle. Closeted gay, Mr. Garrison developed to function in a world that was hostile to homosexuality, creating identity that could survive through denial and repression. When that became unsustainable, openly gay Mr. Garrison emerged to handle the reality of living authentically as gay man. When that alter faced stresses it could not manage, Mrs. Garrison emerged as someone who could experience sexuality and identity completely differently, essentially hitting reset button on accumulated trauma and complications. Each new alter represents the system's attempt to find identity that can function without being overwhelmed by trauma, by life circumstances, or by the psychological weight of previous alters' experiences. The violent differences between alters are not choices Garrison's making about how to present himself. They are fundamental personality distinctions between separate identities who happen to share the same body. Each alter genuinely experiences itself as a distinct individual with its own preferences, beliefs, and personality structure. When alters switch, it is not performance or act. It is a different person taking control of the shared body and living according to that person's distinct psychology. The core identity, lost to trauma. The most profound and disturbing implication of the DID theory is the question of who the original Garrison actually is. Before the trauma, before the fragmentation, there was a child who would have developed into integrated adult personality if abuse had not occurred. That child's personality was the core self, the person Garrison was meant to become. But severe trauma before age 9 prevented normal integration. The core self could not survive experiencing the abuse as single unified consciousness, so it split into fragments. Each fragment developed independently into the alters viewers have seen. But what happened to the original? In many DID cases, the original personality remains as alter within the system, often as child alter who stopped developing at the age when trauma occurred. In other cases, the original personality fragments so completely that no single alter represents the core self. The original is lost, existing only as scattered pieces distributed across multiple alters, with no possibility of recovery or reintegration. The theory proposes that original Garrison has not appeared at any point in the series. Every identity viewers have witnessed is protective, alter created after the core self was destroyed by trauma. The original Garrison, the child he was before abuse fractured him, is either buried so deep within the system that he never emerges, or was so completely destroyed by trauma that he no longer exists in any recoverable form. This raises profound existential questions. If the core self is gone, who is Garrison? Is he the collection of alters who share his body? Is he none of them because none represents his true identity? Is there even such thing as true identity for someone whose self was destroyed before it could fully form? These questions have no comfortable answers. The tragedy of DID is not just the fragmentation itself, but the loss of the integrated person who could have existed if trauma had not intervened. Garrison will never know who he was meant to be, because that person was destroyed before he had chance to develop. Every alter is adaptation to trauma rather than authentic self-expression. Even if Garrison achieved integration through intensive trauma therapy, bringing all alters into awareness of each other and working toward cooperative functioning or fusion, he still could not recover original self because that self was annihilated by abuse before it could fully form. The best outcome would be creating new, integrated identity built from fragments of traumatized alters, but this would still be something constructed rather than something recovered. The original Garrison is gone forever, victim of whoever abused him so severely that a child's mind shattered rather than remain whole to experience it. Why he cannot maintain stable self. Garrison has tried repeatedly throughout the series to find stable identity, to land on sense of self that feels right and can be maintained. Each time he adopts new identity, there is an initial period where it seems to work, where he seems more comfortable and more functional than before. But inevitably, the identity fails. He becomes dissatisfied, dysphoric, unable to continue existing as that version of himself. Then new identity emerges, beginning cycle again. This pattern is not indecision or identity confusion in normal sense. It reflects the fundamental instability of DID system, where no single alter can maintain control indefinitely. Each alter has limited tolerance for stress and limited capacity to handle all aspects of life. When alter reaches its limit, it can no longer maintain control, and another alter must switch in. From external perspective, this looks like Garrison repeatedly changing his mind about who he is. From internal perspective, it is different people taking turns living the life, with each person eventually becoming overwhelmed and relinquishing control to another. DID does not resolve without intensive specialized trauma therapy. The disorder is a survival mechanism that developed because trauma was too severe to process and integrate. Simply living life, accumulating experiences, or finding better circumstances does not heal the fragmentation. The alters remain separate, taking turns controlling behavior, losing time when other alters are in control, accumulating separate memories and separate developmental trajectories. Integration, the therapeutic goal of bringing alters into awareness and cooperation, potentially fusing into single personality, requires years of specialized treatment focusing specifically on processing the trauma that created the fragmentation and helping the alters develop communication and cooperation. Garrison has never received this treatment. He shows no awareness that he has DID. He experiences his identity shifts as changes he is choosing, rather than recognizing them as different personalities taking control. Without awareness of the disorder, and without treatment addressing it, he is trapped in a cycle of switching between alters who each function until they cannot, then give way to another alter who continues the pattern. This will continue indefinitely. Garrison will never find stable identity through the various alters he tries because no alter is complete enough to handle all of life. He will keep switching between fragments of self, each incomplete, each eventually failing, each giving way to another equally fragmented identity. The only escape would be recognizing the fragmentation and undertaking intensive trauma treatment, but his lack of awareness makes this impossible. He is trapped in system his childhood trauma created, living fractured existence across multiple identities, none of which is the person he was meant to be. Mr. Garrison is not person. He is a collection of fragmented identities created when catastrophic childhood sexual abuse destroyed a developing personality before it could integrate. The gay teacher, the trans woman, the lesbian, the president, these are not expressions of Garrison's identity, but separate, protective alters who emerged to handle life that core self could not survive experiencing. Each alter has its own memories, its own personality, its own understanding of who it is. Each alter takes control when previous alter can no longer cope. None of them is real Garrison because real Garrison was annihilated by trauma before he could become fully formed person. Mr. Hat and Mr. Slave were external representations of internal fragmentation before the splitting became complete. The memory gaps, the personality discontinuities, the violent shifts between identities, all are symptoms of severe dissociative identity disorder caused by abuse so catastrophic that child's only survival option was for his self to shatter. The original Garrison is gone. What remains is a collection of trauma responses taking turns living life that was meant to belong to someone who no longer exists. Integration is theoretically possible through intensive therapy, but Garrison lacks awareness of his fragmentation and will likely continue cycling through alters indefinitely, each failing in turn, each replaced by another fragment equally incapable of living complete life. The abuse did not just harm Garrison, it destroyed him. What viewers see is the wreckage trying desperately to function as person. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Wendy Testaberger, the future sociopath theory. Wendy Testaberger, the future sociopath theory. Wendy Testaberger appears to be the most well-adjusted, intelligent, and genuinely good person among South Park's children. She maintains excellent grades, leads student council, champions progressive causes, and generally operates as voice of reason and morality within the chaotic elementary school environment. She is activist who stands up against injustice, student who takes education seriously, and leader who organizes others toward positive goals. Adults trust her. Other students respect her capabilities, even when they disagree with her positions. She seems destined for success and positive impact on the world. But beneath this perfect exterior lie troubling patterns that become visible when Wendy faces threats to her status, challenges to her positions, or competition for dominance. When threatened, Wendy does not respond proportionately or reasonably. She responds with calculated violence and systematic elimination of threats. Her activism, examined closely, always positions her in leadership roles and grants her power over others. Her relationships are characterized by manipulation rather than genuine connection. Her inability to tolerate losing or being challenged reveals pathological need for dominance. According to the theory, Wendy is not the well-adjusted leader she appears to be. She is developing sociopath who has learned to hide her nature behind progressive activism and perfect student performance. Unlike Cartman, whose sociopathy is obvious and isolating, Wendy is learning to mask her disorder behind socially acceptable facades. She is more dangerous than Cartman precisely because no one suspects her, and by the time her true nature becomes undeniable, she will have accumulated the education, social capital, and professional position to cause harm, on scale that childhood sociopath could never achieve. The violence behind the activist. The most revealing evidence of Wendy's dark nature comes from the episode Breast Cancer Show Ever, where Wendy fights Cartman after he makes insensitive jokes about breast cancer. The context makes Wendy sympathetic. She is defending breast cancer victims and standing up to bully. But examination of the actual fight reveals something far more disturbing than justified retaliation. Wendy does not simply defeat Cartman in fight, or even beat him up severely enough to teach him lesson. She brutalizes him with prolonged, methodical violence that goes far beyond what the situation called for, or what defense of breast cancer victims required. The beating is planned. Wendy does not attack impulsively in moment of anger. She schedules the fight, prepares for it, and executes systematic assault. During the fight, she does not stop when Cartman is defeated. She continues hitting him when he is down, when he is begging her to stop, when any reasonable person would recognize he has learned his lesson. She beats him until he is bloody and broken, and she clearly enjoys doing it. Her facial expressions during the fight show satisfaction and pleasure, not righteous anger or reluctant necessity. This was not about defending breast cancer victims. This was about having excuse to hurt someone with social permission. The disproportionate violence is diagnostic. Normal people, even when righteously angry, feel discomfort when hurting others. They might fight when necessary, but they do not take pleasure in causing pain, and they stop when threat is neutralized. Wendy showed no discomfort and extensive pleasure. She turned justified conflict into opportunity for brutality, using the socially acceptable cause as cover for indulging violent impulses. The theory proposes this is pattern with Wendy. She positions herself as defender of good causes, not out of genuine compassion, but because activist identity provides perfect cover for dominance and control. When she attacks someone under banner of social justice, she is protected from consequences because she can claim she was fighting for important cause. The cause justifies the violence in observers' eyes, preventing them from recognizing that the violence was disproportionate and that Wendy enjoyed it more than any genuine activist would. This represents sophisticated understanding of how to use social systems to enable antisocial behavior, far more advanced than Cartman's obvious cruelty that alienates everyone. Stan as manipulation practice. Wendy's relationship with Stan Marsh follows pattern that reveals her manipulative nature. Throughout the series, Wendy and Stan have dated, broken up, gotten back together, and cycled through this pattern multiple times. The pattern itself is revealing. Wendy controls when they are together and when they are apart. Stan's feelings remain relatively consistent. He cares about Wendy and wants to be with her. But Wendy's feelings appear to change based on what serves her interests at any given moment. When she wants attention or emotional support, she pursues Stan. When she finds someone more interesting, or when relationship becomes inconvenient, she breaks up with him. She uses Stan's consistent feelings as resource she can access when needed and discard when not needed. Stan is emotionally devastated by their breakups, while Wendy moves on quickly and easily. This asymmetry indicates manipulation. If Wendy genuinely cared about Stan as a person with his own feelings and needs, his suffering, when she breaks up with him, would affect her emotionally. She would experience guilt or sadness about hurting someone she claims to care about. Instead, she shows minimal emotional impact, suggesting Stan's feelings are not real to her in a way that would create empathy. He is useful when useful and forgettable when not. The relationship serves another function for Wendy. It is practice for future manipulation. Sociopaths learn manipulation tactics through experimentation and observation. They discover what works by trying different approaches and noting results. Stan is perfect test subject because he genuinely cares about Wendy, making him vulnerable to emotional manipulation. Wendy can experiment with different tactics: withdrawal of affection, provision of attention, creating jealousy, making demands, and observe how Stan responds. She is learning what emotional buttons to push, how much manipulation someone will tolerate, how to keep someone invested despite treating them poorly. These lessons will serve her throughout life as she moves on to more important targets with more resources worth controlling. Stan thinks he is in a romantic relationship. Wendy is conducting training exercises for sociopathic manipulation, using his real emotions as material for her learning. The fact that she can maintain this pattern without apparent guilt reveals absence of empathy. Normal person would feel bad about hurting someone repeatedly, even if they did not love that person romantically. Wendy shows no evidence of this guilt, cycling through the pattern with Stan as though his emotions are interesting phenomena to observe, rather than real suffering of person she claims to care about. The power behind the causes. Wendy's activism deserves scrutiny because it consistently results in Wendy gaining power and authority while claiming to serve others. She does not participate in causes as one contributor among many. She leads them, positions herself as spokesperson and decision maker, and ensures that fighting for justice also elevates her status and control. This pattern suggests her motivation is not genuine concern for causes, but recognition that progressive activism provides perfect vehicle for power seeking while maintaining appearance of altruism. When Wendy advocates for environmental causes, for social justice, for victims of various injustices, she always frames herself as the leader who will solve the problem. She organizes others, tells them what to do, and positions herself as most knowledgeable and most committed. The causes give her moral authority. Anyone who questions her is not just disagreeing with her, but is opposing justice itself. This is sophisticated power strategy. By tying her personal authority to moral causes, she makes challenging her authority equivalent to opposing morality. People who might otherwise question why a 10-year-old girl is demanding they follow her instructions instead comply because she has framed compliance as moral imperative and resistance as moral failing. The theory proposes that sociopaths frequently hide behind progressive causes because activism provides perfect cover for dominance and manipulation. They can control others, demand compliance, attack enemies, and accumulate power while claiming every action serves greater good. People do not suspect activists of being sociopaths because activism requires caring about others' suffering, and sociopaths, by definition, do not care. But sociopaths understand intellectually what others care about, even if they do not feel it emotionally. They learn to speak the language of compassion and justice as tool for manipulation, not as expression of genuine feeling. Wendy has learned this already at age 10. She uses language of social justice fluently, positioning her desires as aligned with moral imperatives. When she wants something, she frames it as necessary for justice. When she attacks someone, she frames it as defending victims. The causes provide cover and justification for behavior motivated purely by her own need for dominance. If Wendy were genuinely motivated by compassion and justice, her activism would sometimes put her in positions where she serves others without gaining power, where she supports causes that do not elevate her status, where she works anonymously for good outcomes without needing recognition. But her activism consistently results in Wendy being in charge, being recognized, being granted authority. This pattern reveals that the causes are vehicles for her ambitions rather than genuine commitments. The inability to lose. Wendy's responses to losing or being challenged reveal pathological intolerance for anything that threatens her perceived superiority. When she faces competition, whether academic, social, or political, she does not simply try harder or gracefully accept defeat. She becomes dangerous. Her responses escalate beyond what circumstances warrant, targeting threats with determination to eliminate them completely. In episodes where other students challenge her leadership or academic standing, Wendy does not compete fairly or accept that others might be better in some areas. She undermines competitors, manipulates situations to ensure their failure, and in extreme cases resorts to violence or threats. This intolerance for competition is diagnostic. Normal people, even highly competitive ones, can tolerate losing occasionally. They experience disappointment, but move on. They recognize others' success without experiencing it as existential threat. Wendy cannot do this. Any challenge to her superiority is experienced as attack that must be destroyed. This reveals underlying psychology, where her sense of self is entirely dependent on being superior to others. She has no stable internal identity beyond being the best, the smartest, the leader. Any evidence suggesting someone else might be equal or superior threatens her entire sense of who she is. This fragility beneath apparent confidence is characteristic of sociopathy. Sociopaths often present as extremely confident and superior, but this presentation masks deep insecurity. They lack genuine self-worth because they lack emotional connection to themselves or others. Their sense of value comes entirely from external markers of success and from dominating others. When those external markers are threatened, when domination is challenged, they experience it as intolerable threat requiring extreme response. Wendy's perfect student performance, her leadership positions, her moral authority from activism, these are not expressions of genuine confidence, but defenses against the emptiness where normal self-worth would exist. Losing threatens to reveal that emptiness, so losing is not acceptable under any circumstances. The theory proposes that as Wendy ages and competition intensifies, her responses to threats will become more sophisticated and more dangerous. Currently, she can use violence in schoolyard setting with minimal consequences. As an adult, direct violence will be unacceptable and would expose her nature. She will learn to destroy competitors through professional means, through social manipulation, through systems and institutions rather than fists. But the underlying drive will remain: eliminate anyone who threatens her superiority by any means necessary. The pattern of elimination. Examining Wendy's behavior across multiple episodes reveals pattern where threats to her position face systematic consequences. She does not simply compete with rivals, she eliminates them. When another girl becomes popular or threatens Wendy's social standing, Wendy does not accept the competition. She works to destroy the competitor's reputation, turn others against her, or drive her out of the social group entirely. When teacher or administrator does not defer to Wendy's leadership, she does not accept their authority. She undermines them, organizes opposition, or finds ways to have them removed. The elimination is calculated rather than impulsive. Wendy does not lash out emotionally and immediately. She plans, gathers information about targets' vulnerabilities, and executes a campaign designed to completely neutralize the threat. This is sociopathic pattern of identifying threats and systematically removing them. Normal competitive people compete within understood rules and accept that some threats cannot or should not be eliminated. Sociopaths recognize no such limits. Every threat can be eliminated if the right approach is found, and eliminating threats is necessary for maintaining dominance. The sophistication of Wendy's elimination strategies is particularly concerning because it indicates she is learning and refining these skills. Each eliminated threat teaches her lessons about what works, what tactics are most effective, how to avoid consequences while destroying competitors. She is accumulating expertise in manipulation and elimination during childhood that will make her extraordinarily effective and dangerous as an adult. Most sociopaths do not begin developing these sophisticated strategies until late teens or adulthood. Wendy is developing them at 10, giving her years of additional practice and refinement before she enters professional world where consequences are more severe, but potential rewards of successful manipulation are much greater. Why she is more dangerous than Cartman and Wendy are both sociopaths, according to their respective theories. But Wendy represents far more dangerous development trajectory. Cartman's sociopathy is obvious. He alienates everyone with his cruelty, selfishness, and lack of empathy. Adults recognize him as problem child, even if they do not understand the severity of his disorder. His peers know he is a terrible person, even when they continue associating with him. Cartman will grow into a recognized monster. People will see him coming, avoid him when possible, and be on guard when interaction is necessary. This limits his potential for harm because his targets are warned. Wendy's sociopathy is hidden behind perfect facade. She is trusted by adults, respected by peers, and positioned as moral leader. No one suspects her of having antisocial personality disorder because she has learned to perform empathy convincingly and to frame her dominance seeking as altruistic service. This makes her infinitely more dangerous. She will be able to get close to people who would never trust someone like Cartman. She will be welcomed into positions of authority and influence that would never be granted to obvious sociopath. She will be believed when she lies because her reputation provides credibility. She will be defended when accused because people cannot reconcile their image of progressive leader Wendy with possibility that she is manipulative predator. Additionally, Wendy is developing her manipulation skills within frameworks that society rewards. Cartman's manipulation is crude and obvious, rejected by social systems. Wendy's manipulation operates through activism, academic achievement, and leadership, all things that society encourages and rewards. She will continue being rewarded for behavior patterns that are actually expressions of her disorder, allowing her to refine and strengthen those patterns, while accumulating credentials and social capital. By the time she is adult, Wendy will have prestigious education, professional accomplishments, network of influential connections, and reputation as passionate advocate for justice. Behind this impressive resume will be sociopath who learn to use progressive causes as cover for domination, who learn to eliminate competitors through systems rather than violence, who perfected performance of empathy and moral conviction while feeling neither. She will be positioned to cause harm on institutional and societal scale, affecting hundreds or thousands of people through her professional decisions and influence, all while maintaining appearance of being force for good in the world. Cartman will be recognized villain. Wendy will be celebrated leader. Cartman's victims will know they were harmed. Wendy's victims will blame themselves or never recognize they were manipulated at all. The calculated nature. What distinguishes Wendy from normally developing children is the calculated quality of her behavior. Children are impulsive. They act on immediate emotions without planning or consideration of consequences. They learn social skills gradually through trial and error, making obvious mistakes. Wendy displays none of this normal childhood impulsivity or social awkwardness. Her actions are planned. Her manipulations are sophisticated. Her timing is strategic. She waits for right moments, chooses her battles carefully, and executes her plans with precision that should be impossible for a 10-year-old. This planning ability indicates advanced understanding of social dynamics and manipulation that must come from innate capability rather than learned behavior. Normal children do not naturally understand how to manipulate social systems, how to frame their desires in terms others will accept, how to identify and exploit others' vulnerabilities. Sociopathic children do understand these things naturally because their different neurological structure gives them advantages in cold strategic thinking that others develop only much later, if at all. Wendy's calculated nature appears in how she chooses which causes to champion. She does not simply support whatever issues she personally cares about. She identifies causes that will enhance her status and authority while being difficult to oppose. Environmental causes, anti-bullying campaigns, advocacy for victims. These are positions that grant moral authority because challenging them means appearing to support pollution, bullying, or victimization. Wendy has learned to choose battles that position her opponents as villains, regardless of the substance of their positions. Her strategic thinking also appears in how she manages her reputation. She maintains perfect student performance, not because she values education, but because grades are currency in school social system. She cultivates relationships with adults in authority, not because she respects them, but because their approval grants her power over peers. She positions herself as moral leader not because she cares about morality, but because moral authority is most powerful form of social control. Every choice is strategic, aimed at accumulating power and maintaining dominance. Normal children make choices based on what they enjoy, what interests them, what their friends are doing. Wendy makes choices based on what will enhance her position. This level of strategic thinking in child indicates she is already operating with sociopathic calculation that most people never develop. Wendy Testaberger is developing sociopath hiding behind perfect student and progressive activist facades. Her intelligence, social skills, and strategic thinking are being deployed not in service of genuine morality, but in service of dominance and control. Unlike Cartman, whose obvious sociopathy isolates him and limits his potential for harm, Wendy is learning to hide her disorder behind socially acceptable and even celebrated behaviors. She will continue being rewarded by society for behavioral patterns that are actually symptoms of personality disorder, allowing her to accumulate education, professional credentials, social capital, and institutional power. By the time her true nature might become apparent, she will be too well positioned for anyone to stop her effectively. Adults who suspect something wrong will dismiss their concerns because Wendy's record is spotless. Victims will not be believed because Wendy's reputation provides armor. The beating of Cartman was a warning sign. When socially acceptable excuse presents itself, Wendy will indulge in disproportionate violence and enjoy it. But she has learned that violence leaves evidence. As she matures, she will refine her elimination tactics to use systems, institutions, and social manipulation rather than fists. In 20 years, Cartman will be known monster avoided by everyone. Wendy will be celebrated professional, possibly in politics, law, or activism, with power to affect thousands of lives and no one suspecting that the passionate advocate for justice feels no genuine compassion and views other humans as obstacles to be eliminated or resources to be exploited. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the South Park within South Park theory. The South Park within South Park theory. South Park constantly breaks the fourth wall, acknowledges its own status as television show, and includes characters commenting on production quality, animation style, and narrative structure. Stan and Kyle occasionally reference that they are an animated program. Cartman makes jokes about episodes, broadcast schedules. The show has featured multiple episodes examining its own creative process, showing meetings between characters and creators, and explicitly discussing South Park as entertainment product consumed by audiences. For many shows, this would simply be meta-humor, postmodern jokes about the artificiality of television. But South Park's fourth wall breaking is so extensive, so consistent, and so structurally integrated that it suggests something beyond mere meta-comedy. The theory proposes that South Park is not depicting real events within its own universe. Instead, South Park is a television show that exists within the world of South Park. The characters viewers watch are actors performing fictionalized versions of themselves, and the increasingly meta-commentary represents the show acknowledging its own fictional nature within its fictional universe. Every episode viewers watch is simultaneously being watched by people within the South Park universe, making South Park a show within a show, a fictional creation inside another fictional creation, reality and performance so entangled that they become indistinguishable. The behind-the-scenes evidence. The most direct evidence for this theory comes from episodes explicitly depicting South Park's production process. These are not subtle hints or ambiguous references, but direct presentations of the show as manufactured product, created by identifiable people for broadcast to audiences. Multiple episodes have shown characters meeting with Matt Stone and Trey Parker, the actual creators of South Park, who appear as characters within the show's universe. In these episodes, the boys from South Park interact with Matt and Trey as real people who create a television show about their town. The episodes do not frame these interactions as impossible crossovers or fourth wall breaking jokes. They present them as normal interactions between people who exist in the same reality. Episodes focused on censorship and controversy have shown production meetings, editing processes, and broadcast decisions. Characters discuss what can and cannot be shown on television, what will offend audiences, what networks will allow. These discussions only make sense if South Park exists as a television show within its own universe. If the events viewers see are supposed to be real events happening to real people in Colorado town, there would be no production meetings or censorship debates, because there would be no show being produced. The Cartoon Wars 2-part episode explicitly deals with South Park as a television program that other characters watch and have opinions about. Characters from within South Park universe discuss episodes of South Park, debate the show's content, and attempt to influence what the show depicts. This creates impossible recursive situation, unless South Park is indeed a show within its own universe, with some level of reality creating fictionalized entertainment based on that reality. The characters know their animated characters in South Park, particularly Stan and Kyle, have made direct references to animation quality, art style, and production limitations. They have commented on how things are drawn, how characters look, and how animation has changed over the series' run. These observations only make sense if the characters are aware they exist as animated creations, rather than as real people in real world. Real people living real lives do not notice animation quality, because real people are not animated. The comments about animation are not jokes for viewers' benefit, but acknowledgments by characters that they understand their medium. The episode Back to the Pilot, where Stewie and Brian travel back to Family Guy's first episode and comment on crude animation, has direct parallel in South Park episodes, where characters reference the show's visual development. Stan has noted how South Park looked different in early seasons. Kyle has joked about production shortcuts. These meta-observations indicate the characters have some level of awareness that they exist within created entertainment, rather than experiencing organic reality. This awareness suggests they are not simply characters in story, but actors or animated personas who understand their status as performances. They know they are in show because they are literally in show. They are performing for in-universe cameras, following in-universe scripts, creating in-universe entertainment product. The Celebrity Appearance Paradox. South Park features constant appearances by real celebrities playing themselves. Politicians, actors, musicians, athletes, and other famous individuals appear in South Park, Colorado, interacting with the town's residents and becoming involved in local events. On surface, this seems like standard animated show convention where famous people make guest appearances. But the frequency and nature of these appearances creates logical problem if South Park is meant to be real town experiencing real events. Why would countless celebrities constantly visit small Colorado mountain town? What draws them there? Why did they become embroiled in local conflicts and situations? The celebrity appearances make far more sense if South Park is a television show within its own universe. Celebrities appear because they are guest starring on the show. They visit South Park not because the town is an interesting destination, but because appearing on South Park, the television program, provides publicity and entertainment value. Their interactions with main characters are not organic meetings, but scripted appearances designed for entertainment value. This explains why celebrities' appearances often feel staged, and why their involvement in South Park events seems contrived. The contrivance is not failure of writing, but accurate representation of how celebrity guest appearances work on television shows. They are artificial insertions into narrative rather than natural developments of story. The continuity reset explained. One of South Park's most persistent patterns is the reset button that appears between most episodes. Major events occur, characters die, buildings are destroyed, relationships end. Then next episode begins with everything back to normal. Dead characters are alive without explanation. Destroyed buildings are intact. Relationship conflicts are forgotten. If South Park depicts real ongoing events in actual town, these resets are frustrating continuity errors that undermine narrative coherence. But if South Park is a television show within its own universe, the resets make perfect sense as production decisions made by show's creators. Each episode is separate broadcasts that in-universe creators can approach independently. They can choose to ignore previous episodes' events, reset situations to default state, or maintain continuity when it serves story purposes. The inconsistency is not failure, but accurate representation of how episodic television works. Shows make decisions about what to remember and what to forget based on what serves current episode, rather than maintaining rigid continuity. Characters who died in previous episodes return because in-universe creators decided to bring them back. Buildings destroyed dramatically are intact next episode because in-universe producers chose to ignore that destruction. Relationship developments are forgotten because writers found those developments inconvenient for new stories. The reset button is not magic within story. It is production choice made by in-universe creators of South Park, the television show. Why no one ever changes character development in South Park is minimal across the series' 20-plus seasons. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny remain in 4th grade, despite showrunning for decades. Adults do not age visibly. Relationships and dynamics remain relatively static. Characters do not learn from experiences or grow based on events they have lived through. This stasis is common in animated sitcoms and usually explained as convention of the format. Shows maintain status quo, so each episode can be approached independently. But if South Park is show within its own universe, the lack of aging and development has different explanation. The in-universe creators have decided to keep characters at same ages and in same roles because this serves the show's format. It is deliberate production choice to maintain frozen timeline where 4th graders remain 4th graders indefinitely and adults remain the same ages season after season. The characters do not age because actors are playing them as specific ages for purposes of the show. The frozen timeline is not reality, but artistic decision made by in-universe creators, who preferred their characters to remain in elementary school where certain types of stories work better. This explains why characters occasionally reference the passage of time or acknowledge that they have experienced events across many years while somehow remaining the same age. They are aware of the contradiction because they are aware they exist in show with floating timeline where chronological time passes, but character aging does not. The layers of reality. If South Park is show within its own universe, this creates complex layers of reality that nest inside each other. At the deepest level, there is presumably a real South Park where real people live real lives. Matt Stone and Trey Parker exist at this level as creators who decided to make television show based on their town. They have created fictionalized, exaggerated version of South Park for entertainment purposes. The boys, their families, and other residents have been turned into characters, played by actors or created as animated personas that bear some resemblance to real people, but are not accurate representations. At the next level, there is South Park, the television show that exists within the universe, broadcast to in-universe audiences who watch it for entertainment. Characters within this show are performing scripted roles, following narratives created by Matt and Trey. This is the South Park that viewers of the actual show are watching, the in-universe broadcast. At the 3rd level, there is our reality where actual viewers watch South Park on Comedy Central or streaming services. We are watching the same show that in-universe audiences watch, creating parallel viewing experience across layers of fiction. The meta-commentary works on all these levels simultaneously. When characters break the 4th wall, they are acknowledging both their fictional status to actual viewers and their performed status to in-universe audiences. The jokes work because ambiguity about which level of reality is being referenced creates space for multiple interpretations. Matt and Trey as in-universe creators episodes, showing Matt Stone and Trey Parker as characters within South Park, establish them as existing at higher level of reality than the characters whose show they create. They are real people within the South Park universe who have created fictionalized entertainment based on their town. The boys are aware of Matt and Trey, know that they create South Park the show, and occasionally interact with them about production decisions or creative choices. This relationship reveals the structure. Matt and Trey exist in base reality of South Park universe. They create television show about South Park that fictionalizes real people and events. The show is broadcast to audiences, including potentially to the real people it depicts. When South Park characters interact with Matt and Trey, they are not breaking into creators' reality, but rather interacting with creators who exist in same universe but at different level. The level of people making show, rather than the level of people within show. This structure explains numerous otherwise inexplicable elements of the series. It explains why characters can be aware of being in show without this awareness breaking the show's reality. They are in show, their awareness is accurate. It explains production inconsistencies, continuity errors, and tonal shifts. These are decisions made by in-universe creators whose choices shape what viewers see. It explains the show's increasing self-awareness and meta-commentary. As South Park has continued, it has become more comfortable explicitly, acknowledging its own nature as created entertainment. Why this theory makes sense. The South Park within South Park theory provides elegant explanation for aspects of the show that otherwise require dismissing as postmodern humor or production convenience. The extensive fourth wall breaking is not just comedy, but accurate representation of show's structure. The celebrity appearances are not contrivance, but logical result of show attracting guest stars. The continuity resets are not failures, but production choices made by in-universe creators. The frozen timeline is not limitation, but deliberate artistic decision. The theory is supported by show's own explicit content. Episodes have directly presented South Park as a television show that exists within its universe, with creators and production process that shape what viewers see. The theory does not require inventing explanations or reinterpreting content. It simply takes seriously what the show has been saying about itself. The only question is, how much of what viewers see is the in-universe show, versus how much is base reality that show depicts. The ambiguity may be intentional, keeping audiences uncertain about which level of reality they are watching, whether the boys are real people with show about them or are entirely fictional creations, whether anything in South Park universe is real, or if it is fiction all the way down. South Park is not documentary of actual town in Colorado. It is television show that exists within its own universe, broadcast to in-universe audiences who watch fictionalized adventures of South Park residents. The characters are performances, whether by actors or as animated personas, created for entertainment rather than accurate representation of reality. Matt Stone and Trey Parker exist in the South Park universe as creators who produce this show, making decisions about continuity, character development, and narrative structure that shape what audiences see. The extensive meta-commentary is not breaking rules of television, but characters and creators acknowledging the performed nature of what viewers watch. Everything is show within show, performance within performance, fiction nested inside fiction. Somewhere beneath all these layers might exist real South Park with real people living real lives, but viewers never see that level. What they see is entertainment product created for in-universe audiences, which happens to also be entertainment product created for actual audiences. The show's self-awareness is not postmodern joke, but accurate acknowledgement of its own nature. South Park knows it is South Park. The characters know they are characters. The creators know they are creators. Everyone is performing, and the performance acknowledges itself as performance while still functioning as entertainment. This is South Park's ultimate meta move, being exactly what it claims to be, while claiming to be exactly what it is, creating infinite loop where fiction and reality become indistinguishable because fiction has admitted it is fiction, which makes it more honest than any claim to reality could be. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.